Imagine yourself resting now, as if lying within the quiet chambers of a medieval hall, the stone walls softened by the glow of a single lantern. Outside, the evening mist curls gently along narrow streets, where the cobbles glisten faintly from the day's passing rain. A river moves at its steady pace nearby, its waters carrying both silence and time itself. Somewhere, a hearth crackles, sending the faintest warmth into the room, while the smell of wood smoke mingles with the cool night air. The hour is late, the world is hushed, and there is nothing pressing that requires your attention. This moment is simply one of stillness. Tonight, we are not here for battles or noise, but instead to wander slowly through the quieter corners of history. We will drift into a world where medieval lords, though rarely seen directly, quietly guided the course of entire kingdoms. Their presence was not always felt in trumpets or banners, but in subtler ways through the tolling of bells that ordered the hours of a village, through the unseen hand that arranged the division of fields, through the careful records written by their stewards and clerks. Their power was often invisible, yet ever present, shaping lives in ways so ordinary that many scarcely noticed it. Like the steady current of a river, it was not dramatic but constant, flowing through every aspect of daily existence. When we imagine the Middle Ages, it is easy to picture knights clashing in armor or kings seated upon gilded thrones. Yet most of life did not unfold in grand courts or on noisy battlefields. Instead, it was lived in the rhythm of seasons, in the labor of hands that sowed and reaped, in the creak of wagon wheels carrying goods to market, in the quiet flicker of oil lamps guiding evening prayers. This is the world we will enter tonight, not one of spectacle, but one of quiet endurance and steady habit, a world where history unfolded in whispers rather than in shouts. Close your eyes if you wish, and picture the countryside stretching. Beyond castle walls, fields lie open beneath the soft light of the moon, their furrows damp with dew. Cottages huddle together along winding lanes, smoke rising from their chimneys in thin grey threads. The night carries the scent of earth, hay, and the faint sweetness of apples stored for winter. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls, its sound hollow and lingering. The villagers are asleep, yet even in their rest they remain under the watch of unseen authority, the quiet presence of a lord whose influence touches every acre of land, every measure of grain, every toll of a bell. In the great hall of the manor, a fire glows low in the hearth, its embers red as they settle into ash. Long trestle tables stand empty, save for a few scattered cups and platters from the day's meals. The carved beams above are shadowed, and banners hang still against the stone walls. Here, during daylight, disputes are heard, accounts are checked, and plans for fields and rents are quietly made. Yet at night, the hall is silent, filled with the kind of calm that seems to hum softly in the air. It is in this silence that we pause, listening to the past with gentle attention. The power of medieval lords was rarely about loud declarations. It was often about the unseen order that kept life moving. The steward walking carefully with a ledger, the reeve ensuring work was done, the bailiff checking barns for stored grain. These figures carried out the wishes of the Lord in ways that shaped daily existence. And yet, to most villagers, this authority was simply the background of life, no more questioned than the rising of the sun or the coming of rain. In such constancy, we find a rhythm both steady and soothing. Imagine yourself walking along a dirt lane toward the edge of a village. The houses are simple wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, small gardens growing herbs and cabbages. A dog stirs at your passing, then curls back into its slumber. You hear the trickle of water in a nearby brook, mingling with the faint sound of sheep shifting in their fold. Above, the stars are bright, clearer than we often see today, and they stretch endlessly across the night sky. The quiet weight of centuries seems to hang in the air, reminding us of how deeply rooted such lives once were. What makes this world calming is not its lack of hardship, for certainly life was not easy, but rather the persistence of its daily patterns. People rose with the dawn, worked by the sun, and rested by the fire. The pace of life was steady, neither rushed nor hurried by modern clocks. Each day folded into the next, bound by traditions and rituals, by church bells and harvests, by fairs and fasts. To picture such a life is to imagine stepping into a rhythm that is slower, gentler, and more connected to the earth. The lords who presided over this order were not always seen, but their hand was everywhere. It was in the rights granted to hold a market, in the tolls collected at a bridge, in the permission for a mill to turn upon the river. Their authority was woven into the fabric of daily life, guiding it as softly as a shepherd guiding sheep across a hillside. Though we often think of history as dramatic, much of it was this: quiet oversight, subtle influence, and the constant shaping of society through ordinary acts. And so, tonight, as you rest, let us not chase the clamor of battles or the roar of trumpets. Let us instead linger on the calm details, the glow of lanterns against stone walls, the rustle of wind through hedgerows, the sound of quills scratching upon parchment in a dimly lit chamber. Let us imagine the faint smell of bread cooling on wooden boards, the warmth of wool cloaks hung beside a hearth, the slow tolling of a church bell at dusk. These are the things that truly carried the Middle Ages forward, not the noise of war, but the quiet persistence of everyday life under the steady, unseen hands of those who guided it. So lie back now, and let this history unfold as a soft and gentle story. There is no need to remain awake for every word. This journey is not about remembering dates or events, but about drifting into the atmosphere of a time long past. You may find yourself half dreaming of misty fields, of stone halls, of river water sliding calmly past a mill, and that is enough. Tonight, the story of lords and their hidden power is simply a backdrop for your own rest, a soft murmur of the past, carrying you gently into sleep. The day inside a medieval lord's residence began and ended beneath the glow of lanterns. These were not lanterns as we might know them today, made with bright glass and polished metal, but simpler, humbler things. They were crafted from horn, oiled parchment, or sometimes thinly scraped animal skin stretched over wooden frames. Inside, small candles burned with a quiet, uneven light. Their glow was warm but not strong, flickering gently against the stone walls of the great hall. The light filled the room with shadows as much as with brightness, creating an atmosphere that felt both protective and mysterious. When a person entered such a space, they would see lanterns hanging from beams or placed carefully on tables, their flames trembling with each draft of wind that crept in through cracks in the walls. This light set the rhythm of life in the hall, a rhythm that began before dawn and continued until the quiet moments of night. The great hall was the heart of the manor. It was not only the center of authority, but also the space where meals were shared, disputes were heard, and celebrations unfolded with modest ceremony. To imagine it fully, you must picture a long rectangular chamber with thick stone walls, often damp with the cold of the seasons. The floors were usually made of beaten earth or covered with rushes, plants gathered from the riverside and spread to soften the ground. These rushes absorbed the dirt of daily life, and they were changed several times a year, sometimes sprinkled with herbs like lavender or mint to freshen the air. Above, heavy wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, darkened by years of smoke. Rising from the central hearth, the smell of wood smoke was constant, lingering in every fabric, cloak, and tapestry. Even when the fire burned low, the faint scent of ash and charred would always remain. In this room, a lord's presence could be both distant and immediate. He might sit at the high table on a raised platform at one end of the hall, a simple chair beneath a canopy marking his authority. Yet his rule was not only in where he sat, but in how the space around him was organized. On ordinary mornings, the hall was not filled with ceremony, but with the hum of small tasks. Servants swept ashes, scrubbed wooden tables, and prepared benches. For the day's gatherings, the steward arrived with his parchments, sometimes stored in wooden chests or tied carefully with leather cords. Quills were sharpened, ink was prepared, and lists of rents, dues, and deliveries were quietly checked. There was nothing loud or dramatic about these actions, yet they carried more weight than any speech. Through the scratch of ink upon parchment, the order of the estate was maintained. Outside the walls of the hall, life carried on in the fields, in cottages, and in small workshops. But within this chamber, decisions shaped the rhythm of that life. A miller's toll might be confirmed, a dispute over a boundary stone settled, or instructions sent to a reeve about the repair of hedges. These were not grand events to record in chronicles, yet they touched every household in the Lord's lands. The authority that flowed from the hall was not loud or forceful, but steady, like the lantern's light, soft, persistent, and enduring. If you listen closely to the hall in your imagination, you might hear the crackle of the fire at its center. This hearth was more than warmth, it was a gathering place. During cold months, people drew close to it, stretching out hands, stiffened by the chill. The flames cast a golden glow upon faces, softening their features in the dim room. Shadows moved gently across the walls, climbing up to the rafters, where sometimes birds or small animals found a home in the thatch. The hearth was also the place where food simmered in great iron cauldrons, filling the hall with the earthy scent of barley, leeks, and onions. Bread baked nearby, its crust crackling as it cooled, ready to be placed upon tables when the Lord and his household gathered for meals. Meals themselves were not constant feasts of luxury. For most days, the food was plain but nourishing. Dark bread, ale brewed from barley, pottages of beans or root vegetables. On special occasions, richer dishes appeared, but more often it was the simplicity of daily bread that sustained everyone. These meals bound the community together. Servants, retainers, and sometimes even villagers might gather in the hall during festivals, each finding a place at the long tables, their wooden bowls and cups set before them. The clatter of spoons and quiet murmur of conversation filled the air. Above it all, lantern light flickered, reminding everyone that the hall was both home and heart, authority and hearth. To those who lived within the Lord's walls, the hall was a place of both duty and shelter. For the steward, it was a workplace where records were kept and accounts balanced. For the servants, it was a place of endless tasks, sweeping, carrying, serving, fetching. For the Lord, it was a seat of power, but also a place where he dined, rested, and listened to songs or stories during the darker months. It was not a space reserved only for grandeur. It was a lived-in room, smoky and warm, filled with the sounds of daily life. In the quieter hours, perhaps late at night, when most of the household had gone to rest, the hall became almost dreamlike. The lanterns, dimmed as candles, burned low, and the fire crackled softly, sending sparks upward. The benches stood empty, and the long shadows stretched across the rushes. In those moments, the hall was hushed, as if it too were breathing slowly in the silence. Outside, the wind might sigh against the shutters, or a distant dog bark in the village. But inside, the hall held its peace. It was in such silence that one could truly sense the enduring nature of these spaces, how they sheltered generations, how they witnessed countless ordinary days, how they formed the quiet foundation of kingdoms. The lanterns in the great hall remind us that history is not only about crowns and battles, it is also about the glow of small lights in smoky rooms, about the patient work of stewards and servants, about the steady pulse of daily life. The Lord's unseen management, carried out here through careful records and whispered instructions, shaped the fate of entire communities. Yet for those who lived it, it was not a story of power and politics. It was simply life, unfolding day by day under the gentle glow of lanterns. And so, as we linger in imagination within this hall, let us rest in its atmosphere. Picture the beams overhead, the banners gently stirring in the draught, the faint scent of herbs strewn across the floor. Listen to the fire's soft crackle, the distant murmur of voices fading into night. Let the lantern's light guide your thoughts slowly toward calm, as if history itself were lulling you into sleep. The hall remains steady, its stones patient, its wood seasoned, its air filled with the memory of countless lives lived quietly within its walls. The first light of dawn arrives softly over the medieval countryside, casting a pale shimmer upon the fields that stretch across a lord's estate. At this hour, the air is cool and damp, touched with the scent of earth that has rested through the night. Dew glistens across the grass, gathering in silver droplets that sparkle briefly before the sun rises high enough to warm them away. The sky itself is not sudden in its light, but gradual, shifting slowly from deep blue to faint gray, and finally to the gentle blush of morning. In this hour, before the clamor of tools begins, and before voices rise across the land, the world is quiet. The only sounds are the calls of birds greeting the day, and the faint stirring of animals within their stables. This is the beginning of the rhythm that would guide the lives of peasants, laborers, and farmers throughout the year, a rhythm so steady that it seemed eternal. Life on the fields was bound to the turning of seasons, and those seasons were overseen, quietly but firmly, by the presence of a lord. He might not walk these fields often, yet his authority was felt in every furrow. It was his reeve who assigned plots, his steward who collected rents, his officials who measured yields. When a man bent his back to guide the plough, or when a woman stooped to gather herbs by the hedgerow, they did so within a system shaped from above. Though it was carried out in silence and habit, the Lord's influence was not seen in sudden commands, but in the fact that every furrow belonged to someone, and every harvest was counted. The peasants worked not only for themselves, but also for the manor, for the estate, for the castle that loomed, perhaps distant, on the horizon. To picture this morning fully, imagine a ploughman beginning his day. His oxen stand patiently, their breath steaming in the cool air. The wooden plough is heavy, its iron-tipped blade ready to cut into the soil that has lain hard through the night. With slow steps, the oxen move forward, their hooves pressing deep into the damp earth, while the blade slices a furrow behind them. The soil turns, dark and rich, releasing the smell of leaf hidden beneath the surface. Each furrow is straightened, with care, for the land must be tended in order, neat and true. The man guiding the plough is not hurried. His pace is the pace of the animals, the pace of the field, the pace of a task that cannot be rushed. The sound of creaking wood, of leather straps straining, of earth falling aside, creates a rhythm as steady as the beating of a drum, though softer, gentler, like the heartbeat of the land itself. All around him, the village stirs. In cottages, roofed with thatch, smoke begins to curl upward from chimneys as fires are rekindled. The smell of baking bread drifts across the air, mingling with the damp scent of grass. Children stir in their beds of straw, rubbing sleep from their eyes, while mothers fetch water from nearby wells. The clatter of wooden pails, the splash of water, the sound of voices speaking softly in the morning air, all of these blend into the texture of the day's beginning. Each family has its task. Some gather tools and step into the fields. Others tend to animals in stables or pastures. The rooster crows, though by now many are already awake, for dawn itself is the true signal of the day. In the distance, hedgerows stretch between fields, alive with birdsong. Small brown sparrows dart among the branches, and blackbirds sing. From the tops of hedges, the air is alive, but it is not noisy. It is calm, filled with a steady pulse of life that does not demand attention, but simply continues. To walk among these fields at dawn would be to step into a scene both ordinary and timeless, a scene repeated for generations with little change. The tools might be simple wooden rakes, iron sickles, clay water jugs, but they served as extensions of hands that knew their use by instinct. In such work there was no need for innovation, only for patience. Though the Lord himself might remain unseen, his presence was woven into the details of this life. The fields belonged to his estate, and the cottages clustered nearby stood upon his land. The villagers paid rents, not always in coin, but often in kind. Sacks of grain, baskets of eggs, bundles of wool. Their labor sustained not only their families, but the manor as a whole. And in turn, the manor provided them with protection, with structure, with a place in the order of things. This exchange was not loudly declared each day. It was simply lived. When a man walked into the field with his hoe, he knew his labor would feed his household and his Lord's table alike. The balance of power was not shouted, but breathed, steady as the oxen moving through soil. The emotional world of these peasants was shaped as much by hope as by habit. Each dawn carried both the promise of food and the fear of failure. Too much rain could spoil the fields. Too little rain could dry the soil to dust. A harsh winter might leave stores empty before spring's renewal. Yet still, each morning they rose, tied their belts, and went to work. Their hope was steady, humble, born of necessity rather than grand ambition. They hoped for bread on the table, for children, growing strong, for enough wood to warm the hearth. These were modest hopes, but they were deeply human, carrying them through the years in quiet resilience. As the morning grew brighter, the fields themselves seemed to change in color. The soft gold of the rising sun spread across barns, thatch, and earth, turning the damp dew into brief jewels that sparkled before fading. The shadows grew shorter, and the rhythm of work settled in. Men guided plows, women gathered herbs or carried baskets, children watched animals or fetched water. The manor reeve might walk among them, a quiet figure ensuring that each task was tended. There was no shouting, no great display, only the calm oversight that ensured the estate moved like a steady clock. His presence was a reminder of the Lord's distant gaze, a reminder that their labor was not their own alone. Even the animals were part of this rhythm. Oxen strained against plows, their bodies massive yet patient. Sheep grazed in meadows, their wool slowly thickening in the seasons. Growth, Chickens pecked at the earth near cottages, scattering through patches of grass. Dogs padded softly at the edges of fields, alert but calm. The world was full of life, not chaotic, but ordered by habit, by repetition, by necessity. It was this order that made survival possible, this order that gave each person a place, and this order that reflected the Lord's authority, subtle but complete. As noon approached, the pace slowed. Tools were set down, and meals were shared. In the fields, bread, cheese, and ale formed the staples of this midday rest. Families sat together, sometimes under the shade of hedgerows, sometimes upon the very soil they worked. Conversation was not always lively. Often it was quiet, words exchanged between bites, laughter soft and fleeting. The sound of birdsong continued, joined now by the droning hum of bees moving among wildflowers. After a time, work began again, slower in the warmth of the sun, but steady all the same. This cycle: work, rest, work. Rest was not only the rhythm of the day, but the rhythm of life itself. Each morning resembled the last, yet each was vital. Each carried its share of labor that could not be ignored. It was in this constancy that the community endured. The morning light over quiet fields was more than scenery. It was the frame upon which the entire structure of medieval society was built. Lords and castles might stand in stone, but it was the daily work of these peasants, under dawn's glow, that sustained kingdoms. As evening approached, the fields softened once more. Tools were gathered, oxen led back to their shelters, and families walked slowly toward their cottages. The sky deepened in color, shifting from gold to orange, then to the muted gray of dusk. Smoke rose once more from chimneys, carrying the smell of stews simmering in iron pots. Children's laughter faded as they grew tired, and the last birds called before silence settled in. The day closed as it had begun, gently, quietly, under the watch of the land and the unseen authority of the Lord. The morning light over quiet fields was not a single moment but an eternal one. It repeated every day, across seasons and across generations. It was the scene of resilience, of labor, of hope. It was a reminder that history is not only shaped in courts and councils, but also in furrows drawn by oxen, in dew that glistens on grass, in bread broken beneath hedgerows. These mornings, simple and constant, held the true heart of medieval life, a heart that beat not loudly but steadily, enduring through centuries of change. The steward was neither a king nor a knight, neither a priest nor a poet, and yet he carried a quiet authority that touched nearly every life within a medieval lord's domain. To speak of lords and castles is to speak of symbols, of towers rising over fields and banners fluttering in the breeze. But to speak of a steward is to speak of parchment, ink, and numbers, of a man who stood between ruler and ruled, who kept order not with swords or proclamations, but with records and the patient scratch of a quill. Without him, the estate could not breathe. Without his ledgers, the rhythm of rents and harvests would falter. He was, in his quiet way, the pulse of administration. Imagine him in the early morning, walking slowly across the courtyard to the manor hall. His cloak is plain, not adorned with embroidery or fine cloth, but practical, suited for days that begin in chill mist and end in long hours at a wooden desk. In his hands he carries a small satchel, perhaps of leather, in which lie parchments, folded letters, or a thin ledger tied with cord. Around him, servants are already at work, a boy fetching water, a cook stirring embers in the kitchen, a stable hand brushing down the horses. The steward nods to them, not unkindly, yet always with the air of someone whose thoughts are already half in the books that await him. Inside the hall, the fire burns low, and light streams in faintly through narrow windows. He sets his satchel down upon a heavy table and begins his daily routine. The quills are checked, trimmed to fine points with a small knife. Ink, kept in simple earthen pots, is stirred and tested with a careful hand. Parchment, costly and precious, is unrolled, smoothed, and set before him. The day's work is not glamorous, but it is essential, for here, in the quiet marks of pen and ink, the entire structure of the Lord's power is preserved. Each line written by the steward is a line of history, though not the kind sung in ballads or carved into stone. He writes of rents owed in grain, 5 bushels from one tenant, 8 from another, perhaps a note that one field yielded less this year due to rain. He records obligations in wool, the fleeces from a shepherd's flock, spun into value that would one day line cloaks or be sold in distant markets. He lists services owed in labor, days spent repairing hedges, tending the Lord's fields, or carting timber from the forest. These words are not dramatic, but they are the skeleton upon which kingdoms stood. Without such accounts, the Lord could not know what he possessed, and without knowing, he could not rule. The steward's ledger was more than a book of numbers. It was the memory of the estate. Each entry told a story, sometimes quietly tragic, sometimes gently hopeful. A family that once paid in hens might now pay in coin, showing the slow drift toward a money economy. A widow's name might appear, her dues adjusted, reflecting both her hardship and the Lord's measured mercy. A note might be made of a tenant who left the land, replaced by another, the cycle of human lives woven into the fabric of administration. In these details, the steward charted not just wealth, but the flow of lives lived under the shadow of the manor. The act of writing itself was unhurried, almost meditative. The scratch of the quill against parchment echoed softly in the hall, mingling with the crackle of fire and the distant sounds of work outside. Each letter formed with care, the ink pooling slightly at the curves, drying slowly in the cool air. When a page was complete, it was sometimes sealed with wax, pressed with the signet of the Lord to mark its authority. These seals, though small, carried weight. They were symbols of continuity, of legitimacy, of power exercised not with noise but with quiet certainty. To those beyond the hall, the steward's work was rarely seen. Peasants bent over their fields might never glimpse his ledgers, and yet their lives were recorded within them. Each sheaf of grain carried to the barn was noted. Each day of labor spent repairing ditches or fences was marked. Each payment, whether in eggs, wool, or coin, was written down with precision. Their toil became lines of ink, preserved in books that might outlast their very names. In this way, the steward held the memory of their labor, turning the sweat of the brow into the order of the estate. There is something deeply human in this quiet record-keeping. It reflects a need for stability, for structure, for the assurance that obligations are clear, and that the cycle of giving and receiving will not collapse. The steward himself, though bound to the Lord, also carried a responsibility to the people. His fairness or lack of it could shape lives. A lenient steward might allow a late payment in a poor season, understanding the hardship of hunger. A strict steward might insist on dues regardless, leaving families to scrape through the winter. His decisions, though written in small letters, weighed heavily upon human lives. We may imagine him pausing at times, quill in hand, reflecting upon the words he has written. Outside, the voices of children drift across the courtyard, laughter mingling with the calls of livestock. The smell of baking bread wafts in from the kitchen. Life continues around him, full of noise and warmth, yet here he sits, shaping that life into lines of order. He is not the master of the estate, but its caretaker, in another sense the one who ensures that the balance holds, that the fields give what is expected, that the barns are full, that the obligations between lord and tenant remain steady. The steward's ledger was not only about the present, but about the future. Each record became a guide for the seasons to come. How much grain was stored? How much wool was sold? How many days of labor could be expected in the spring? These were questions that shaped the very survival of the manor. In times of plenty, the ledger recorded abundance. In times of scarcity, it marked the careful rationing that ensured survival. Without such foresight, without such written memory, even the mightiest lord could find his estate faltering. And so, while lords were celebrated for their bravery in battle or their generosity at feasts, it was often the steward who quietly ensured that the wealth to fund such bravery and generosity existed at all. He was the one who balanced the scales, who turned fields into figures, who transformed toil into tally. His books did not boast, but they endured. In monasteries and archives, some such ledgers still survive, their pages yellowed, their ink faded, yet their lines still legible. They whisper across centuries, telling us of rents in barley, of obligations in wool, of names long forgotten by the world, but preserved here in the memory of ink. As the day passed, the steward might step outside to walk among the barns or the fields, checking that stores matched the records. He might speak with the reeve, ensuring that labor was organized. He might meet with villagers, listening to their petitions, balancing their needs with the demands of the Lord. His presence was quiet but constant. His authority carried not in weapons but in knowledge. He knew the estate better than anyone, the number of animals in the pasture, the measure of grain in the granary, the obligations owed by each tenant. In this knowledge lay his strength, and in his ledgers lay the strength of the Lord. Evening came slowly, as it always did, with the fading of light and the soft glow of lanterns once more illuminating the hall. The steward gathered his parchments, carefully stacking them, tying them with cord, placing them in chests or shelves where they would be safe from damp or fire. He trimmed his quills, cleaned the inkpots, and set them aside for another day. The hall grew quiet as servants withdrew. As the fire burned low, outside, the village settled into its own rhythms. Animals tethered, doors closed, families gathered around their hearths. Within the hall, the steward's work was done, yet its effects lingered, woven into the order of life itself. The steward's ledger was not a book of grandeur. It did not speak of battles won or crowns claimed, but it spoke of something deeper, something more enduring. It spoke of the daily exchange between land and people, between labor and sustenance, between lord and tenant. It charted the quiet pulse of medieval society, reminding us that beneath the stories of kings and knights lay another story, the story of records kept, of obligations remembered, of life preserved in ink. Without such ledgers, power would lose its shape. With them, it endured steady, silent, and timeless. And as we close our eyes now, imagining the steward setting down his quill, the hall dim in lantern light, the air thick with the faint scent of parchment and smoke, we may rest in the thought that history itself is not only noise and spectacle, it is also the scratch of a pen, the sealing of wax, the turning of pages. It is also the quiet work of those who kept memory alive, who gave structure to society, who ensured that life, in all its ordinary detail, continued. The steward's ledger was not a tale of glory, but a tale of endurance, and perhaps that is the truest story of all. The sound of bells was one of the most constant presences in medieval life. In villages scattered across a lord's domain, their tones drifted through fields, across rivers, and into cottages built of timber and thatch. They were not loud in the way of armies or markets, but steady, patient, and familiar. A bell was a voice of time itself, speaking to all who lived within hearing. It marked hours of prayer, the beginnings of work, the gathering of harvest, the arrival of feasts, and the solemnity of funerals. For people who lived close to the soil, with the days shaped by sun and season, the bell was a reminder that life was more than the labor of the hands. It was also the rhythm of faith, of order, of belonging. In the cool morning, when mist still clung to hedgerows and the first light stretched across ploughed furrows, a bell might toll from the village church. Its note carried far, softened by fog, yet clear enough to stir both peasant and priest. For those in the fields, it was a gentle call to pause, to lift eyes from the earth, and to remember that life moved, not only in seasons of work, but in hours of devotion. The bell gave shape to time. Before clocks were common, before the exact division of hours by machinery, the bell was the measure by which people lived. The village itself often seemed to grow around the church. Though cottages and barns clustered near, it was the church tower that stood tallest. Even if modest, built of rough stone and simple wood, it was a landmark, visible from surrounding fields and lanes. From this tower, the bell hung suspended, a piece of metal shaped by fire and hammer, consecrated by ritual, and gifted by the Lord, whose patronage ensured its presence. The bell was both sacred object and communal tool. Its sound was a prayer, in metal, yet also a signal for daily life. The ringing of bells could mean many things. At dawn, a small bell might sound to mark matins, the early prayer. At mid-morning, another toll might call to terce. At noon, the bell might summon to the Angelus, a pause in labor for reflection. Vespers in the evening marked the turning of the day toward rest. To those who labored in fields, who had no sundial or clock, these notes divided the day. They were threads of time, weaving a shared rhythm that connected farmer, craftsman, priest, and child. The bell was impartial. It rang for all, no matter how poor, no matter how noble. Its sound united. Beyond the hours, the bell also announced events. At harvest time, its ringing marked festivals where villagers gathered to give thanks. During fairs, it called people to the marketplace, where stalls were set with bread, cloth, and tools. During holy days, its peal carried joy, rising above laughter and music. And in times of sorrow, the slow tolling of the bell announced death. Its mournful voice spread across meadow and stream, telling each listener that a life had ended and prayers were needed. The bell thus spoke the language of life itself, sounding joy, duty, and grief in tones that all could understand. It is easy to forget, in our own time of silent mornings and artificial clocks, how deeply sound shaped medieval lives. The bell was not mere noise, it was guidance, reassurance, and command. When it rang, the people listened. They stopped work to pray. They gathered in the square. They prepared for danger when the bell rang urgently, perhaps warning of fire or attack. To ignore the bell was almost unthinkable, for it carried not just metal's voice but the authority of God, of the Church, and of the Lord who had given it. The bells were also symbols of community identity. Villagers took pride in them. A cracked bell, one that rang poorly, brought embarrassment. A strong bell, whose note carried across valleys, brought honor. The casting of a bell was itself a moment of significance. Craftsmen melted copper and tin in great furnaces, pouring molten bronze into molds shaped with care. When cooled and polished, the bell was not only tested for tone but blessed in solemn ceremony. Holy water was sprinkled. Prayers were said. Sometimes the bell was given a name, as though it were a living member of the community. Its voice would carry for generations, long after the hands that made it were gone. For the Lord, the bells had meaning to his patronage, ensured that churches stood, that towers were built, that bells were hung. Though he might dwell in a distant manor, his influence was carried by every peal. To hear the bell was, in some quiet way, to feel his presence. His wealth provided the metal, his power ensured the priest. His authority underpinned the order that allowed such rituals to continue. In this way, the bell connected not only heaven and earth, but also lord and village. It was a chain of belonging, binding each to the other. Life in the village moved in rhythm with these sounds. A child waking in the morning might stretch to the toll of the first bell, then run to fetch water before school or labor began. A woman at her loom might pause at noon, bowing her head as the bell rang out across fields. An old man resting near the hearth might close his eyes at vespers, comforted by the familiar sound that had guided him since youth. For each, the bell was a companion, steady, unchanging, always present. The emotional weight of bells cannot be overlooked. Their tones stirred comfort, yet also awe. They were believed to drive away storms, to protect from evil, to sanctify the air itself. When thunder rolled across the sky, bells were sometimes rung to calm the heavens, the sound believed to scatter the darkness. When plague or fear swept through, bells were tolled to call for prayer, their resonance binding people together in shared hope. In joy, they were bright. In sorrow, they were heavy. Their sound entered the soul, shaping memory, binding hearts. If we walk in imagination through such a village, we would hear bells mingling with everyday noises. The lowing of cattle, the calls of children, the creak of cartwheels, the steady beat of a smith's hammer, yet always, above or beneath, the possibility of a bell. Its tone might drift softly on the wind, almost unnoticed, yet, when attended to, it gave meaning. Even silence between bells carried expectation, a knowledge that soon the sound would return, marking once more the pulse of life. As dusk approached, bells often rang to signal the curfew. The word itself comes from cover fire, a reminder for villagers to bank their hearths, to prepare for night. The curfew bell meant safety, a drawing in of life, a closing of the day's labors. Children hurried home, doors were latched, fires were covered, and above the village, the final peal of the evening drifted into darkness, leaving a calm silence that carried people into sleep. The bell, faithful and constant, would return again with dawn. Through centuries, bells became keepers of memory. Their voices rang out during births, marriages, deaths, wars, and peace. Each sound was etched into the lives of those who heard. Generations passed, but the same bells tolled. A child once lulled by their sound grew old beneath them. A family leaving the village might carry in memory the tone of its bell, the voice of home. And when strangers arrived, the bell was among the first sounds to greet them, telling them they had entered a community bound by shared rhythm. Even now, many such bells still hang in towers across Europe. Some are cracked, their tones imperfect. Some are preserved, still strong, ringing as they did centuries ago. Their voices remind us that history is not only seen in ruins and castles, but heard in sounds that continue to echo. To imagine a medieval village without its bell is to imagine a body without a heartbeat, Quietly, steadily, they marked time, gave comfort, and bound people together in a shared story of endurance. And so, when we think of power in medieval times, we may think of swords, castles, and banners, but we should also think of bells. They were softer instruments of order, yet no less significant. They called without force, yet people obeyed. They guided without punishment, yet people followed. They were the voice of community, the thread of time, the gentle authority that shaped lives. And in their steady ringing, they revealed a truth, that the power to shape a kingdom did not always shout. Sometimes, it simply rang across the fields, clear and calm, like the sound of bells across the village. Market days in the medieval world were times of quiet excitement. Most days in a village passed with the slow rhythm of fields, hearths, and prayers. But when the appointed market day arrived, the air itself seemed to stir with gentle energy. The stillness of barns and cottages gave way to the murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, and the soft clatter of goods being laid out for display. Beneath timbered stalls, rough yet carefully made, merchants unfolded their wares. Baskets of onions, earthy and pungent, sat beside wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. Wooden bowls held dried herbs. Bolts of cloth, dyed in muted shades of brown, blue, or green, were unrolled for eyes to see and fingers to touch. The market was not only an exchange of goods, but of presence, of sight, sound, and smell, all woven into a tapestry of communal life. The market did not belong entirely to the people. Behind its simple activity lay the shadow of the Lord, who granted rights for trade, who authorized the day and the place, who ensured tolls were collected at the gate or at the stall. His steward might walk quietly among the crowd, noting the flow of coins, the weight of goods, and the order of the event. Yet, though the Lord's authority was ever present, it was not always heavy. For most who came, the market was not about power, but about connection. It was a pause in the hard cycles of agricultural labor, a chance to see neighbors, to hear news, to greet familiar faces, to feel for a moment that life was more than toil. The air of the market was rich with scents. The smell of hay drifted from carts that carried animals for sale. Freshly baked bread gave warmth and comfort to the senses. Fish, salted and carried inland, added their sharp note to the mix. Herb sage, rosemary, thyme gave a freshness that cut through the heavier smells. Leather, wool, and smoke blended in the background. For the people, these scents were not unusual, but familiar, part of the texture of life. The market brought them all together, condensed into a single place, so that each breath carried the essence of the world they lived in. Sounds shaped the market just as much as scents. The murmur of voices, not loud, but steady, created a kind of music. Bargains were discussed in soft tones. Children laughed as they followed parents, wide-eyed at the sight of new wares. Animals bleated, lowed, or clucked from pens. Hooves clattered against packed earth. Coins rang softly in the palm as they changed hands, their metallic tone brief but distinct, a signal of value passing from one to another. Unlike the clash of swords, or the shout of orders, these were sounds of peace, of cooperation, of ordinary exchange. They gave reassurance, for they reminded all who heard them that life continued, that food and cloth and tools would be available, that community endured. The stalls themselves, built of timber and canvas, were humble but functional. Some were permanent, standing near the center of the town, their beams darkened by years of smoke and rain. Others were temporary, set up for the day with poles, ropes, and planks. Beneath them, goods were displayed with care. Even the simplest items, onions, eggs, were arranged to catch the eye. A potter might set out jugs and bowls, their surfaces uneven, yet smooth to the touch. A blacksmith might lay small tools upon the table, their iron glinting faintly in the light. A weaver might hang woven cloth, letting the texture and color speak for itself. These displays were quiet acts of pride, showing the fruits of labor, in a way that others could appreciate. Markets were also places of news. Here, gossip flowed as freely as trade. A traveler might bring word of distant wars, of kings and lords unknown to villagers. A pilgrim might tell of shrines and miracles. Neighbors might share stories of births, marriages, or deaths. The market was as much a web of voices as of goods. For many, it was the only time to hear of the wider world, beyond the boundaries of fields and forests. Such news might be uncertain, half-true, or shaped by the teller's imagination, yet it mattered. It expanded horizons, giving a sense that life, though rooted in soil, was part of a broader story. The emotional atmosphere of market days was one of mingled eagerness and comfort. Children looked forward to small treats, a sweet, a toy, perhaps a ribbon. Adults anticipated the chance to sell surplus produce or to purchase something rare, perhaps salt or cloth from far away. Even those with little to spend could walk among the stalls, seeing what was offered, sharing in the life of the crowd. Loneliness was lessened, for here, in the gathering of many, each person felt the presence of others. The market was a reminder that no one lived alone, that survival was shared, that community gave strength. Markets were not constant struggle, though survival in the medieval world was often hard. Market days revealed another truth, that life could also be gentle, communal, and full of exchange. The sight of neighbors greeting one another, the laughter of children, the calm work of weighing, measuring, and trading. These were moments of peace. Coins passed softly from hand to hand. A loaf of bread changed owner. A length of cloth was folded and carried home. These acts were not dramatic, but they were essential, and they gave meaning to life as much as any battle or decree. The presence of the Lord hovered quietly over these gatherings. It was his charter that made the market legal, his men who ensured order, his coffers that received tolls. At the town gates, a guard might collect a fee for entry, a small coin, from each merchant who brought goods from afar. Yet this control was not usually harsh. It was part of the fabric of medieval life, accepted as natural. For the people, the Lord was distant, unseen, but his hand shaped the space in which they traded. He gave permission, and they lived within it. Thus, even in the humble act of buying onions or wool, the balance of power was present, though felt only faintly. Through slow repetition, markets became memory. The same stalls returned each week, the same voices, the same smells, the same rhythms. Generations passed, but the pattern endured. A child who once followed a parent through the stalls might grow old to lead their own child. The same cobblestones felt the press of countless feet. The same wooden beams overhead sheltered countless exchanges. Though kings changed, wars passed, and lords rose and fell, the market endured as a constant, carrying the memory of community forward. As the day drew to a close, the market slowly emptied. Stalls were packed, goods returned to carts, coins tied into pouches. The murmur faded, dust settled on the ground where feet had stirred it. The scent of bread and herbs lingered faintly in the air. Villagers returned to their homes, carrying food, cloth, or tools. For them, the day had been both ordinary and significant. Ordinary, because it was simply another market day, part of the cycle. Significant, because it reminded them that life was more than survival, was also sharing, exchanging, belonging. In the quiet after the market, the square seemed empty, yet echoes remained. The faint marks of cartwheels on the earth, the scraps of straw, the silence where voices had been all spoke of what had happened. And in the memory of each person, the market lived on, its sounds and smells woven into the story of their lives. Thus, markets beneath timbered roofs were more than gatherings of trade. They were threads that bound people together, places where the authority of lords met the needs of villagers, where goods and news flowed, where loneliness was eased, and where life revealed its gentler side. In their slow, steady rhythm, they gave shape to time, comfort to hearts, and meaning to community. And though they rarely found a place in chronicles of battles and kings, their quiet significance endured, shaping the real life of the medieval world. For, in the end, history is not only banners raised and swords drawn, it is also onions sold, bread carried home, and coins ringing softly in the palm. Market days remind us of this truth, that power can be subtle, life can be gentle, and meaning can be found beneath timbered roofs, where people gathered, traded, and remembered that they belonged together. Castles stand in our imagination as fortresses of battle, power, and command. Yet behind their heavy walls and towers, behind their gates of timber and iron, life unfolded in rhythms that were often quiet, steady, and uneventful. A castle was not always a place of thunder and clash. More often, it was a place of waiting, of tending, of the long silence between moments of drama. The walls themselves seemed to hold breath across the centuries, carrying the weight of human labor, human hope, and human caution. If we walk back into that world, into the soft dimness of a medieval evening, we find that a castle was as much a home as it was a fortress, as much a workplace as it was a symbol. The watch began with the sentries. A single man, wrapped in a cloak, walked along the walls as dawn rose or as dusk fell, his feet pressed against stone worn smooth by centuries of passage. The air around him might be cool, carrying the dampness of fields and rivers below. He looked outward, not always seeing danger, but always watching. Beyond the walls stretched fields, meadows, and forests. By night, the grass shivered in the wind, and the branches moved like slow waves in the distance. The watch was quiet. Sometimes an owl called from the trees. Sometimes only the faint rustle of the sentry's cloak broke the stillness. His task was not to fight, but to wait, to notice, to keep presence on the wall, so that others could sleep with peace. Inside, the castle stirred with ordinary life. Kitchens began their daily rhythm, the sound of pots set on the hearth, the steady chopping of herbs, the hiss of meat placed over the flame. Firelight flickered against stone walls blackened by years of smoke. The smell of bread rising filled the air, mixed with the sharper scent of onions, garlic, and salted pork. Servants carried water in wooden buckets from the well. Their footsteps echoed in the halls, mingling with the low voices of cooks. For them, the castle was no fortress of legend, but a place of constant work, where food had to be made, clothing had to be washed, floors had to be swept, and warmth had to be kept. Alive through the turning of seasons, laundresses bent over tubs, scrubbing cloth with hands red from the chill of water. They spread linens across lines or over hedges within the castle yard, letting the sun or the cold wind do its work. Their task was quiet, repetitive, and necessary. In chambers above, scribes bent over parchment, their quills scratching softly against the surface. Candlelight trembled over their work, leaving wax to drip slowly beside the ink. They copied letters, accounts, and records, not grand stories of kings and battles, but the ledgers of daily life, lists of goods stored in the granary, records of rents, notes of agreements sealed with wax. These parchments were the breath of the castle, unseen yet essential, for without them the order of life would scatter like chaff in the wind. Children played in the courtyards, their laughter echoed off high walls, bouncing between stone and timber. They chased one another around carts or under stairways, their games simple, their joy clear. For them, the castle was not a symbol of power but a world of discovery. Stairs that wound upward, chambers half in shadow, storerooms filled with barrels, stables alive with the smell and sound of horses. To the young, every corner held possibility. The stone was not heavy, but protective. The walls were not prison, but shelter. The castle, to them, was simply home. The Lord himself might be within or away. If present, he moved with quiet authority, speaking to his steward, consulting parchments, hearing small disputes in the hall. His presence was felt, but not always seen, for the castle's daily rhythm was carried more by those who served, by those whose labor kept each room alive. If absent, the castle continued on without pause, for the true strength of its life was not in a single figure, but in the many who tended it day after day. The stones of the castle, heavy and enduring, seemed almost alive. They carried warmth in the day and released it at night. They drank in rain and held the dampness for weeks. They echoed footsteps, magnifying each sound until even the softest movement felt significant. These stones had seen generations pass. They had heard laughter and prayer, argument and song. They had stood against storms, snow, and the long silence of time. For those who lived within, the stones were constant companions. Their presence gave comfort, reminding all that the walls were strong, that they endured, that life within them was guarded. In the great hall, life gathered at intervals. Meals were taken with simplicity, benches filled with servants, retainers, or guests, the hearth burning at the center. Smoke drifted slowly upward, darkening beams overhead. Trenchers of bread were set out, with meat and ale to follow. Voices rose in low conversation. These were not always feasts of splendor. More often, they were the measured meals of daily life, where sustenance mattered more than display. The hall was warm, not only with fire, but with presence, the shared closeness of people gathered within stone walls, bound by both need and belonging. The chapel within the castle added another rhythm. Bells might ring faintly, calling to prayer. Monks or priests recited words softly in Latin, their tones steady, their cadence calm. Light filtered through narrow windows, casting stripes across the stone floor. Here, the castle touched upon eternity, as those within lifted their thoughts to something greater than themselves. Yet even here, the stillness dominated. The prayers were quiet. The space was hushed. Faith, like stone, was steady, enduring, and patient. The castle was not always at war. Indeed, most of its life was spent in peace. Its walls were ready for defense, but most days they only held silence. The moat reflected the sky, sometimes still, sometimes rippling with wind. The drawbridge creaked under the weight of carts bringing grain, hay, or timber. Horses moved in and out, their hooves echoing on wood and stone. But rarely did alarm disturb the stillness. For those who lived there, days passed, not in clash and cry, but in work, rest, and the soft passing of hours. Evenings settled slowly. Torches were lit along the corridors. Candles burned in chambers. The sound of the sentries' steps returned to the wall, steady, unhurried, patient. Beyond, the fields lay dim in the fading light. Smoke rose from village chimneys in the distance, carrying the scent of suppers being made. The castle looked out across this world, a silent guardian, its towers catching the last glow of the sun. For villagers, its presence meant safety, the sense that order held firm in uncertain times. For those inside, it was the rhythm of another day drawing to a close, another night beginning under stone and sky. As sleep came, the castle grew even quieter. Only the watch continued, footsteps echoing faintly. Dogs stirred in the courtyard, their ears pricked at distant sounds. The wind moved gently through arrow slits, whispering into empty halls. The stones cooled, giving back the warmth they had stored. Dreams filled the chambers, soft and private, while the castle itself seemed to breathe with calm. Night passed in slow silence, hour after hour, until dawn touched the towers once more. In this rhythm, we see the truth of castles. They were not only places of battle or of lordly display, they were homes, workplaces, and communities. Their life was measured not by moments of grandeur, but by countless acts of labor, care, and patience. The quiet watch of castle walls was not empty, but full of bread baking, of children laughing, of scribes writing, of sentries walking, of stones enduring. History remembers the noise of war, but beneath it always lay the greater weight of silence, of ordinary life carried on within walls that seemed to stand forever. And so, to walk through a medieval castle in thought is to step into stillness, to hear the soft scrape of a quill, the low murmur of a prayer, the hush of footsteps on stone, to feel the chill of night wind along the wall, to know that behind every legend of battle stood countless days of peace, where walls were more guardians than weapons, and where people lived their quiet lives under their shelter. The stones remain even now, weathered but standing, carrying within them echoes of all that once was, of watchfulness, of labor, of belonging, of quiet that held an entire world together. The turning of summer into autumn carried with it a rhythm older than any castle, older than any parchment record, older even than the very names of lords and kings. It was the rhythm of harvest, when the sun began to tilt lower in the sky, and the long days gave way to cooler nights. The people of a medieval village turned their thoughts to the gathering of grain, fruit, and all that the soil had given. Fields that had been green in spring now shimmered with gold. Wheat stood tall, barley ripened heavy, and oats bent under their own weight. It was a moment of both labor and celebration, where the effort of many hands came together in unity, for the survival of the coming winter rested upon these days. At first light, mist clung low over the meadows. The grass was wet with dew, and the air carried that sharp scent of ripening grain. Peasants gathered with their tools, simple but effective, sickles curved like half-moons, their edges shining faintly as they caught the sun. The first strokes through the wheat were almost musical, a swish and rustle as stalks gave way. Bound together, the sheaves were stacked in neat rows, left to dry before they would be gathered into barns. Each movement was steady, repeated, and deeply familiar. Harvest was not a time for idleness. From the smallest child who picked stones out of the path, to the eldest who sat at the edge and offered guidance, every person had a place. And yet, for all its labor, the harvest was not without joy. Songs rose from the fields, carried on the wind. Old tunes, known by heart, gave rhythm to the work. Voices lifted together, some strong, some wavering, but all joined in harmony. These songs told stories of past harvests, of seasons when the grain was plentiful, and of years when it had been lean. They reminded the workers of their ancestors, of how the land had been tended for generations. Between the swish of sickles and the calls of birds, the songs gave spirit to the day, making toil lighter and time gentler. Children ran between the rows, their laughter bright against the rustle of stocks. They carried small bundles, or fetched water for their parents, or played at gathering weeds with exaggerated seriousness. For them, the harvest was an adventure, a chance to be among the bustle of adults, to see the fields alive with energy, their games threaded between the lines of labor, like bright ribbons woven into cloth. Dogs trotted alongside, wagging tails and sniffing at the ground. Part of the day as naturally as the sun overhead. At midday, when the heat pressed down, workers paused in the shade of hedgerows or under the wide branches of an oak. Bread was broken and shared, rough loaves carried from cottages, perhaps spread with a little cheese, or dipped into a pot of stew brought from the hearth. Water and ale were passed around, cool and sustaining. These moments of rest were as important as the labor itself, for they reminded all that harvest was not merely work, it was community. Laughter and talk filled the pauses, stories exchanged, news passed, plans for winter discussed. The simple act of eating together bound the people as tightly as the sheaves of wheat that stood waiting in the fields. The lord of the manor, though rarely seen in the fields themselves, was always present in another sense. His authority was marked in the division of land, in the barns where grain would be stored, in the tithes to be gathered and accounted for. The steward, acting in his name, might walk through the fields, noting the progress, measuring the yield in his mind, reminding peasants of their obligations. The harvest was not only a matter of survival, it was a matter of wealth, influence, and power. What was gathered in these weeks would fill storerooms, feed households, pay rents, and supply the Lord's table through feasts and obligations to greater lords or kings. Yet for those bending in the fields, the weight of such authority was less immediate than the satisfaction of full baskets and the hope of a winter without hunger. Barns became the next focus. As carts creaked under the weight of sheaves, the air filled with the smell of straw and dust. Inside the barns, beams groaned under the load, and workers stacked carefully, knowing that a careless pile could mean collapse or each grain was threshed, beaten with flails, until the kernels fell free from their husks, then winnowed with baskets, tossed into the air so that the chaff blew away and the grain fell clean. The sound of flails was rhythmic, steady, like the heartbeat of the season. Dust rose and hung in shafts of light from the barn's high slits, dancing like tiny motes of gold. Even in this labor, there was a kind of beauty. The smell of fresh grain was sharp, earthy, and hopeful. The sight of barns filling gave reassurance. Winter could be endured. Hunger, the shadow always lurking at the edge of medieval life, might be kept at bay for another year. Families looked at the growing piles of grain and felt relief mixed with gratitude. It was not only their work, but the land's gift, shaped by sun, rain, and soil. For all their toil, they remained dependent upon nature's mercy. That awareness gave a sacred tone to the harvest, a sense that what was gathered was not merely food, but blessing. Festivals followed the final gathering. When the last sheaves were stacked, when the barns were secure, the village turned from labor to celebration. Bells rang from the church, marking both thanksgiving and rest. Tables were set in the open air, filled with bread, cheese, apples, and ale. Musicians played fiddles and pipes, their melodies weaving with the hum of voices. Dancers moved in circles, hands linked, feet stamping the earth that had so recently yielded its gift. Torches were lit as evening fell, their flames flickering against the darkening sky. For one night, perhaps for several, the people allowed themselves joy. They had worked hard. Now they would sing, feast, and remember that life, even in its hardship, carried moments of lightness. The Lord's presence might be more visible here. He, his family, and his retainers could join in the feast, offering ale or meat, receiving thanks, and reminding all of his role as patron and protector. Yet even here, his control was subtle. What mattered most to the villagers was not the symbol of authority, but the shared relief, the chance to laugh freely, to eat without worry, to dance under the stars. These gatherings were not only about harvest, they were about hope, about the endurance of community through the cycle of the year. As the season turned, the memory of these days lingered. When snow later covered the fields, when nights grew long and cold, the villagers remembered the warmth of summer sun, the smell of ripe grain, the laughter of children in the fields, the music of harvest festivals. These memories sustained them alongside the bread and ale stored in their cottages. They were proof that even in a world shaped by obligation and authority, there was space for joy, for togetherness, for the simple pleasure of having enough. Harvest was, in truth, the heartbeat of medieval life. Castles stood as symbols. Lords issued decrees. Wars came and went, but without the grain gathered in fields, none of it could endure. The power of lords, the stability of kingdoms, the survival of villages, all rested on the humble work of peasants bending under the sun, their sickles flashing, their songs rising, their hands binding sheaves. The story of history, though often told in battles and crowns, was written more truly in these golden fields, in the quiet strength of harvest days. And so, when we imagine the medieval world, we might picture not only towers and banners, but also the shimmer of wheat in late summer, the sound of sickles swishing, the taste of bread broken under a tree, the laughter of children running free. We might hear the flails in barns, the songs in the fields, the bells at dusk calling to thanksgiving. We might feel the warmth of community, gathered together in labor and in celebration. Harvest was more than survival. It was the rhythm of life itself, binding people to one another, to their Lord, to their land, and to the eternal cycle of season and time. Time in the medieval world was not measured by clocks or calendars as we know them today. Instead, it unfolded in rhythms of nature, in the slow and steady pace of seasons. To those who lived centuries ago, the passing of a year was not a series of dates, but a circle of weather, light, and labor. Winter's frost, spring's awakening, summer's toil, and autumn's gathering. These were the true markers of life. Lords and peasants alike, despite the distance between their stations, found themselves bound to the same turning wheel of the year. Castles and cottages alike stood against the same winds, felt the same rains, and relied upon the same harvests. Winter was the season of stillness. The land slept under its covering of frost and snow. Trees stood bare, their branches etched sharply against pale skies. Fields lay quiet, the stubble of old crops buried beneath white drifts. Villages, too, seemed to slow. Smoke curled steadily from thatched chimneys, marking cottages where families drew close to the hearth. Inside, light flickered upon rough wooden beams, warming walls that creaked in the cold. The day began late and ended early, with the pale sun barely rising above the horizon before it slipped away once more. For peasants, winter was a time of endurance. Food stores, gathered with care during the harvest, were measured carefully. Each loaf of bread, each salted piece of meat, each pot of ale represented survival until spring returned. Children huddled in blankets, grandmothers told stories by the fire, and men mended tools that would be needed in months to come. Work did not stop entirely. Animals still needed feeding, and wood had to be chopped, but life slowed. The pace of the day matched the silence of snow. For many, there was a kind of comfort in this pause. After months of labor, the stillness gave rest, even as it also carried worry about whether stores would last. Lords, too, felt the pull of winter. Within castles, feasts might brighten the long nights, but even there, the abundance was measured. Granaries were checked, supplies counted, and rationed with caution. A wise lord ensured not only his household's survival, but also that of his tenants. If hunger spread among the village, it would weaken the strength of the estate itself. Winter then became not only a test of endurance for the people, but also a quiet trial of leadership for those in power. Yet even amidst caution, there was space for celebration. Christmas, marked with church bells and feasts, brought warmth into the darkness. Candles flickered, hymns echoed, and tables filled with bread, cheese, and ale simple by modern standards, but deeply cherished in their time. Spring, when it arrived, felt like a breath after holding one too long. Snow melted into streams, filling rivers with rushing water. The first shoots of green broke through dark soil, tender and fragile, yet full of promise. Lambs stumbled upon unsteady legs in the meadows, their bleating filling the air with life. Birds returned to barns and hedges, their songs growing louder with each passing dawn. For peasants, it was a season of renewal, but also of labor. Plows carved through damp fields, guided by oxen, preparing the ground for sowing. Seeds were scattered, entrusted to the earth with hope and prayer. Women tended gardens, planting herbs and vegetables that would flavor meals and heal illnesses. Children gathered flowers, their colors bright after months of gray. The Lord's household also stirred with spring's arrival. Stewards accounted for fields, ensuring that obligations were met. Shepherds brought flocks under closer watch, for lambing meant both joy and risk. Kitchens grew busier, with fresh milk and eggs, returning to the table. In chapels, prayers for good harvests filled the air. It was a time of expectation, of work that was lightened by the sight of nature's renewal. Frost still lingered at dawn, but the promise of warmth lay ahead, and with it, the chance of abundance. Summer stretched wide and long. Days began early, with the sun already high before many had broken their fast. Fields became places of constant labor. Grain grew heavy, grass was cut for hay, and fruit ripened in orchards. Men and women worked side by side, scythes swinging in rhythm, sweat on their brows. Children carried water or frightened birds away from ripening crops. Life in summer was demanding, but it was also full of vitality. Rivers ran clear, skies shone bright, and the air carried the scent of wildflowers. In these days, even hardship felt softened by sunlight. In castles, summer meant activity as well. Guests traveled more icily, roads cleared of winter's mud. Markets thrived, bringing traders and goods to town gates. Hunts were organized, with lords and retainers riding through woods in pursuit of deer. Yet even here, the land remained, at the heart of all. Without the steady labor of peasants, without the fields growing ripe, the wealth of lords would falter. Their power was not only in swords or stone, but in the turning of soil, in the quiet rhythm of planting, tending, and reaping. Autumn came as both an ending and a beginning. The fields, now golden, called for harvest. Sickles gleamed in the sunlight as hands gathered grain. Barns filled once more, carts creaked under heavy loads, and villagers bustled with energy. Apples were picked, nuts gathered, and wine pressed from grapes in southern regions. It was a season of labor, but also of relief. Each full barn meant another step toward safety through the winter ahead. Festivals followed, with music and dancing, as though the land itself joined in celebration. For lords, autumn was a season of reckoning. Tithes were collected, rents accounted for, and supplies measured. The steward's ledger filled with numbers that represented survival for all. Feasts were planned, not only as celebrations, but as displays of generosity and stability. A wise lord showed his people that he, too, had shared in the bounty, and that he could provide. Yet beneath the feasts, there was always calculation. How much could be spared? How much must be kept? How to prepare for the uncertainties of the coming winter? Through each season, life moved, not with sudden change, but with gradual shifts. Frost gave way to thaw, thaw to bloom, bloom to harvest, and harvest to rest. The medieval world was, in this sense, deeply patient. Time was not rushed, but endured. Each day connected to the one before it, as surely as the river ran to the sea. The great events of kings and wars may have punctuated history, but for most people, it was the seasons that shaped life most deeply. For peasants, the seasons were teachers. They taught patience, as seeds waited beneath the soil. They taught humility, as storms could undo a year's labor. They taught gratitude, as full barns meant safety. Even lords, though cushioned by wealth, were not free of these lessons. Their castles, for all their strength, could not stand against famine if the fields failed. In this way, the rhythm of nature bound all people together, high and low, in the same fragile web of survival. And yet, beyond survival, there was beauty. To wake on a winter morning and see frost sparkle on hedges, to hear the first swallow return in spring, swooping through the air, to feel the warmth of summer sun on skin after a morning's work, to taste the sweetness of autumn apples, crisp and bright. These moments lingered in memory, shaping the rhythm of the year not only as toil, but as life itself. The gentle pace of seasons gave structure to medieval existence. It guided prayers, marked festivals, and shaped stories told by firelight. It reminded people of their place in a world that was larger than themselves. And though centuries have passed, and clocks now govern our days, there remains something timeless in the memory of that rhythm. It was slow, steady, and deeply human. Circle of life, turning endlessly, as it always has, and as it always will. behind the walls of great manors, within the shadow of castles, and beside the humblest of village huts, there grew something small, steady, and deeply human gardens. Not grand, nor made for show, but practical, fragrant, and life's. These plots of earth, carefully tended, were essential threads in the fabric of medieval life. They gave nourishment, they offered healing, and they carried quiet comfort through the long cycles of the year. To step into such a garden in the medieval world was to enter a space of both labor and peace. Paths might be little more than trodden dirt, edged by stones to keep the plants contained. Low fences of woven wood, known as wattle, sometimes encircled them, protecting tender shoots from chickens or wandering goats. The air carried scents fresh and green, sometimes sharp, sometimes sweet. It was rosemary rising in the warmth of sun, sage brushed by passing hands, thyme crushed underfoot. Alongside herbs grew vegetables that filled the table day by day, leeks standing tall, beans winding upward, cabbage leaves broad and curling. These gardens were not places of idle beauty, though beauty often appeared in them. They were practical, born of necessity, and they stood close to the lives of those who kept them. For peasants, the garden was part of survival. For lords, it was part of sustenance, and also of order, as good management meant that kitchens remained supplied. The herbs themselves carried more than flavor. They were companions in health and healing. Calendula, with its golden petals, could be steeped into salves to soothe wounds. Fennel, with its feathery leaves, was believed to aid digestion. Mint freshened breath and eased stomach aches. Yarrow, gathered from wild edges or grown in neat rows, was pressed against cuts too slow, bleeding. The knowledge of such herbs passed quietly from one generation to the next, whispered at hearthsides or taught by demonstration in the garden itself. This was medicine not of laboratories, but of memory and care. For those who labored in these plots, the work was humble yet constant. In spring, seeds were planted, pressed gently into soil that had been loosened by hand or with simple tools. In summer, watering, weeding, and watching over each plant became a daily rhythm. Autumn brought gathering and preserving. Herbs dried, in bunches hung from rafters, roots stored for winter use. Even in winter, when the garden slept, jars and bundles from the past season stood ready, a quiet promise against illness or hunger. In manorial households, gardens held both common vegetables and rarer plants. Wealthier lords might have access to imported seeds, bringing new varieties into their estates. Monastic gardens, too, played a role. 4 monks were careful cultivators of herbs, recording their properties in manuscripts that would guide healers for generations. Yet even the most modest villager's garden echoed this same pattern: soil, seed, growth, harvest, and the cycle repeated. It is easy to imagine the figure of a woman bending over the earth, hands dark with soil, hair tucked back as she gathers a bundle of parsley, or an old healer sitting by the doorway of her cottage, crushing dried herbs with a mortar and pestle, her hands steady from long practice. Or a child wandering barefoot along rows of cabbages, picking beans with laughter. These were small, quiet moments, but they shaped life as surely as the toll of a village bell or the commands of a lord. For the lord himself, gardens were part of the greater order of estate management. Kitchens relied upon them for stews, breads, and seasonings that kept meals from dullness. Physicians, often employed in noble households, turned to herbs when tending to illness. Even in the great halls, where tapestries lined the walls and feasts filled the air with noise, the invisible presence of gardens lingered in the rosemary tucked into roasted meats, in the mint steeped into drinks, in the sage rubbed into cheese. The influence of those small green corners stretched far beyond their modest size. Emotionally, gardens carried a gentleness that contrasted with the harsher realities of medieval life. They were spaces where time slowed. A woman gathering herbs might pause to breathe the scent of lavender. A man watering rows might listen to bees humming between blossoms. Children played at the edges, weaving flowers into garlands. In these moments, the burdens of labor, the weight of rents, and the worries of weather softened. The garden was not only a source of food and medicine, it was a space of comfort, of steadiness, of quiet renewal. The rhythm of gardens also followed the larger pace of seasons. In spring, hope returned with each sprout breaking through soil. In summer, abundance grew in leaves, fruits, and herbs. Autumn brought the satisfaction of full baskets and jars. Winter required patience, but even then, dried bundles hanging above the hearth, reminded all that life continued. This cycle bound people to the earth, not only in toil, but in gratitude. Gardens could also carry meaning beyond the practical. Herbs were sometimes linked with symbolism. Rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, sage for wisdom. Such associations, wove into stories and customs, carried in songs or blessings. Weddings might be adorned with herbs, funerals with sprigs of evergreen. Thus, the humble plants of gardens touched the deepest rituals of life and death. One might imagine walking slowly through such a garden at dusk. The sun sets low, casting gold across the leaves. A hen clucks nearby, scratching at the dirt for insects. The air is cool, carrying scents both sweet and earthy. A woman kneels to cut herbs, placing them gently into a woven basket. The village beyond hums faintly, but here, within the low fence, all feels steady and timeless. In such a place, one understands how life in the medieval world was not only about struggle or survival, but about small spaces of peace, where the turning of the earth brought both labor and comfort. In truth, without these gardens, the greater machinery of medieval society could not have functioned. Castles depended on their kitchens, kitchens on their gardens, and villages on the herbs and vegetables grown by careful hands. Medicine, too, depended upon the same. Lords may have ruled with banners and decrees, but it was these quiet, green spaces that sustained the rhythm of daily life. Even now, centuries later, the memory of those gardens lingers in traditions. We still carry herbs in cooking, teas for healing, flowers for remembrance. What began in humble soil beneath timbered roofs and stone walls continues, unbroken, into our own lives. And so, the medieval garden, though unremarkable in its time, becomes remarkable in memory, a place of nourishment, healing, and gentle constancy, enduring through ages. And when night came, those gardens fell silent. Moonlight touched the leaves, dew gathered once more, and the earth rested until morning. The people, too, rested, carrying into sleep the comfort of knowing that, come dawn, the herbs and vegetables would still be there, waiting steady, simple, and full of quiet promise. In the medieval world, life was measured not in hours or minutes, but in rhythms of labor, worship, and meals. To sit down to eat was to pause the endless tasks of the day, to share warmth in cottages or in the echoing space of a great hall. Meals were more than sustenance. They were rituals that reaffirmed life, strengthened bonds, and gave comfort in times both harsh and kind. At the heart of these daily rituals lay the simplest foods, bread, ale, and the humble dishes that filled the gaps between them. Bread was more than food, it was the foundation of survival. Villages and towns, castles and monasteries, all revolved around the production of grain. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats were not abstract crops but lifelines, planted with patience and harvested with the sweat of whole communities. Once cut and gathered, grain was threshed, ground at the mill, and carried home as flour. Each step was part of a chain, one link dependent on the next, until at last dough was kneaded and loaves set to bake. The smell of bread, warm and earthy, was a constant presence across the medieval landscape. To wake in the morning was often to wake to the faint scent drifting from cottage hearths, or from the larger ovens that served whole manorial households. The bread itself varied by status and by harvest. Lords and wealthy households ate finer white bread, sifted of coarse husks. Peasants relied more often on darker loaves, made from rye or mixed grains, their texture dense, their crust thick. Yet regardless of quality, bread was sustenance, and without it, life faltered. To break bread was not simply to eat it, was to partake in the continuity of community, to share in what bound people together. Alongside bread, there was ale. Water could be uncertain, carrying sickness when drawn from polluted sources. Ale, brewed from grain and lightly fermented, became the safer and more reliable drink. It was not the strong ale of later centuries, but mild, nourishing, and consumed by all ages. In cottages, brewing was often a household task. Women, stirring great wooden vats, watched the bubbling process with care, the scent of yeast and malt filling the air. For lords, larger breweries within estates supplied endless barrels for both daily meals and feasts. To hear the quiet bubbling of casks was to hear reassurance that there would be drink at table, that thirst would be eased, and that the rhythm of meals would continue. Between bread and ale came the pottage, This simple dish, grain or beans, simmered with whatever vegetables or scraps were available, was the everyday meal of the majority. Thick, warm, and filling. It varied endlessly depending on season and supply. In spring, fresh greens might be added. In summer, peas and beans. In autumn, root vegetables. In winter, dried or salted foods. The bubbling pot on the hearth was as constant as the ticking of time, its steam rising softly in cottages across villages. It was not grand, but it was dependable, and dependability was often the greatest luxury of all. For lords and nobles, meals stretched wider. Their tables displayed roasted meats, spiced sauces, cheeses, fruits preserved or imported. Yet even here, the foundation was the same: bread on the board, ale in the cup. The wealth of a manor could be glimpsed in the variety of dishes, but the continuity of life was still affirmed by these humble staples. The kitchen staff worked tirelessly, bakers rising before dawn to knead dough, brewers watching vats with patience, cooks stirring vast pots for halls of retainers. Behind the apparent grandeur of a noble feast lay the same quiet labor that sustained villages. Emotionally, meals were times of gathering. In a peasant's cottage, family and neighbors might sit together, wooden bowls in hand, bread broken and dipped into pottage. Conversation was quiet, often simple: the state of fields, the weather, a neighbor's health. Yet the act of eating together bound people in solidarity, reminding them that survival was shared. In a manor hall, servants carried platters too long, tables where lords, retainers, and guests ate in order of rank. Even there, despite divisions, the act of eating together built bonds, reaffirming both hierarchy and community. The smell of meals was part of life's fabric: bread crusts crisping in the oven, herbs stirred into stews, onions sizzling in pans, cheese aging in storerooms. For children, the memory of such scents would remain for a lifetime, tying the senses of smell and taste to comfort and home. To walk through a village at midday was to smell wood smoke and boiling pots, to hear laughter, and to sense the unbroken rhythm of human life continuing day after day. There was also symbolism in bread and ale. In Christian ritual, bread and wine carried sacred meaning, the very heart of worship. For villagers, the daily breaking of bread at table echoed this sacredness in quieter form. To be fed was not only a physical act, but a reminder of provision, of community, of life given and sustained. In this way, even the simplest meal carried weight beyond its flavor or texture. The making of bread itself was almost ceremonial. Grain ground at the mill came home in sacks of flour. Women or servants measured it carefully, mixing with water, sometimes with a little yeast saved from the last batch. Hands kneaded dough with steady rhythm, folding and pressing until the texture changed beneath the fingers. The loaves were set to rise, covered with cloth, while the hearth was prepared for baking. When at last they were placed in the oven, time slowed, the anticipation of scent and taste filling the space, and when they were pulled out, steaming crust browned, the satisfaction was deep, quiet, and communal. Brewing ale followed a similar rhythm: grain malted, crushed, steeped, boiled, cooled, yeast added. Then the wait, the slow, patient bubbling, the faint hiss and foam as fermentation began. The casks were sealed, stored in cool places, their contents guarded until ready. This patience, too, carried lessons that life's necessities came not instantly, but with care, time, and steady work. Across the seasons, meals changed, yet their foundation endured. In summer, fresh vegetables lightened the table. In autumn, apples, pears, and nuts appeared. Winter meals leaned on storage: salted fish, smoked meats, dried beans. Spring meals celebrated the first fresh greens after the long cold. Yet whether light or heavy, each meal circled back to the same anchor: bread, ale, and the humble dishes that accompanied them. Children learned early the role of these foods. They watched their mothers knead dough, their fathers bring in sacks of grain, their older siblings stir pottage. They learned to value not luxury, but steadiness, that to have bread each day, to drink ale safely, to share a meal in warmth, was enough. The lesson was quiet, but enduring. That continuity mattered more than excess. For lords, daily meals were also reminders of responsibility. The food on their table was drawn from the labor of peasants, the harvests of fields, the care of servants. Each loaf of bread, each mug of ale, was tied to the vast system of estates. The unseen control of lords was reflected not only in banners or castles, but in the fact that their halls were always supplied. Power was sustained by meals as much as by swords. The quiet joy of meals lay not in grandeur, but in rhythm. Morning bread and ale to begin the day. Midday meals shared between tasks. Evening meals as light faded, the hearth glowing, the family gathered close. These moments, repeated endlessly, gave shape to life. They offered assurance that despite hardship, tomorrow too would bring bread, ale, and the warmth of eating together. If one could stand now in a medieval village at dusk, the scene would be soft and steady, smoke curling from chimneys, the faint smell of bread drifting on the cool air, the sound of laughter from cottages, bowls clinking softly, mugs of ale passed from hand to hand. Inside, families sat close to the hearth, steam rising from pottage, crusts of bread torn and shared. In a manor hall, candles flickered over long tables, retainers eating, servants moving quietly, the lord presiding in calm dignity. In both cottage and hall, the same truth was present. Meals bound life together, quietly, day by day. And when the meal ended, silence returned. The hearth embers glowed faintly, bowls were set aside, casks sealed once more. People settled into rest, comforted by the knowledge that tomorrow, once again, bread would bake, ale would bubble, and life would continue in its steady, unbroken rhythm. In the medieval world, clothing was never a matter of passing fashion, nor was it simply a covering against the cold. Instead, it was the patient result of long processes that stretched from pasture to hearth, from sheep to spindle, from loom to dye vat, and at last to the bodies of those who wore it. To put on a tunic, cloak, or gown was to wrap oneself in countless hours of unseen work, each thread spun, twisted, and woven by steady hands. The story of cloth began in the fields, where sheep grazed across open downs and enclosed meadows. There wool was the wealth of lords, monasteries, and towns, carried in carts, traded at fairs, and even shipped abroad to distant looms in Flanders and Italy. For peasants, however, sheep were also part of local survival. A small flock might belong to a family, its wool carted and spun into yarn for everyday garments. The bleating of sheep in pastures was therefore not only the sound of animals, but also the promise of warmth in the winter to come. Shearing was the first step. Each spring or early summer, when the sheep's fleece grew heavy, men and women with shears clipped away the thick coats. The sound was a soft, rhythmic snip-snip, followed by the rustle of wool falling into baskets. The fleece was then washed, the lanolin-rich grease rising in the warm water, the wool softening under careful hands spread across hedges or grass, the wool dried under the sun, the smell of sheep still clinging faintly to it. Then came the carding, the labor of aligning fibers with small wooden paddles bristling with wire teeth. Back and forth, the wool was combed, teased into order, smoothed until it could be spun. Carding was often done in cottages, where women sat together, their hands moving almost without thought, conversation flowing around the steady work. The piles of prepared wool grew, soft as clouds, ready for the spindle. Spinning was an art. In patience, with distaff and spindle, or later with the spinning wheel, women twisted wool into yarn, drawing it out steadily, keeping tension constant. The spindle whirled, balanced by gravity, twisting fibers into thread. To watch was to see rhythm itself, hands moving, spindle turning, thread lengthening. Spinning was often done by firelight, in evenings when fields no longer called, or during winter days when work pressed closer indoors. It was background music to medieval life, the whir of spindle and the low murmur of voices filling cottages. Once spun, the yarn was ready for weaving. Here, the loom stood as both tool and symbol. In cottages, upright looms or smaller frames leaned against walls, their wooden frames creaking softly. In larger workshops, great horizontal looms filled the space, their beams heavy, their heddles strung with countless threads. The weavers sat with focus, passing shuttle back and forth, pressing treadles with feet, pulling the beater to tighten each row. The loom sang its own song, creak, thump, swish, repeat. Hours disappeared into this rhythm, fabric slowly growing under patient labor. Colors were added with dyes drawn from plants, roots, bark, and minerals. Woad gave shades of blue, madder gave red, oak galls produced brown, and onion skins or weld brought yellow. Dyeing was a process of vats, heated water, and careful timing. Yarn or fabric was lowered into steaming tubs, stirred with long sticks, then lifted out, dripping, to dry in the open air. The colors were soft, earthy, and natural muted greens, faded blues, deep russets. Against the grey stone of villages, these hues glowed gently, a quiet beauty born of soil and plant. For lords and merchants, the wool trade was wealth itself. English wool, especially from the Cotswolds and Lincolnshire, was prized abroad, its fine texture valued by continental weavers. Bales of raw fleece travelled to ports, then onto ships bound for Bruges, Ghent, or Florence. From this trade, fortunes grew, cathedrals rose, and guilds flourished. The lord of a manor measured his prosperity not only in grain and rent, but also in the number of sheep grazing his pastures. The quiet chewing of flocks translated into silver coins in his coffers. Yet for ordinary people, the meaning of wool and cloth was more intimate. It was the cloak wrapped around shoulders in winter, the tunic that endured years of wear, the blanket spread over a child at night. Each garment represented the labor of family members, often women whose hands turned fleece into fabric. A well-made piece of clothing carried pride, the evenness of weave, the strength of seams, the brightness of a dyed stripe. In households with little else to spare, such garments were treasures of comfort and endurance. The repetition of weaving became more than labor. It was a rhythm echoing through medieval life. In cottages, the sound of loom and spindle was as common as birdsong outside. Day by day, thread by thread, fabric grew, slow yet steady. This patience mirrored the wider world, where survival itself was built on small, repeated acts: plowing, sowing, reaping, baking, brewing. The loom was simply one more instrument in the great symphony of continuity. Clothing marked differences in status. The lord might wear long gowns of fine cloth, edged with fur, dyed in costly colors like deep scarlet or royal blue. His ladies' gowns might be embroidered, lined with silk, the work of many hands brought together in luxury. Peasants, by contrast, wore tunics of rougher wool, hose or leggings patched and mended, cloaks heavy but plain. Yet even in their simplicity, peasant garments carried dignity, their strength a symbol of endurance. In both castle and cottage, clothing bound people to their stations, but also to their shared reliance on the loom. Guilds of weavers, fullers, and dyers emerged in towns, regulating trade, teaching apprentices, ensuring standards. In their halls, cloth became more than fabric. It was commerce, law, and livelihood. Yet behind these structures lay the same basic acts: shearing sheep, spinning yarn, weaving cloth. Whether in rural cottages or urban workshops, the work was grounded in human patience. Emotionally, cloth carried memory: a child's first tunic, sewn by a mother's hands; a wedding gown, woven with care and worn with joy; a cloak passed down from parent to child, threadbare, yet still warm. Each piece of fabric bore the imprint of its maker and the lives it touched. To wear a garment was to carry with you the labor, care, and time of others. The presence of cloth extended into sacred spaces as well. Altar cloths embroidered with crosses, banners for processions, vestments for priests all emerged from the same spinning and weaving. The ordinary transformed into the sacred by symbol and use, yet still rooted in the humble labor of looms. If one could walk now through a medieval village, the evidence of cloth would be everywhere. Women at doors, spinning while watching children, looms creaking within cottages, sheep grazing at field edges, lines of dyed fabric drying in the sun, their colors glowing softly against thatched roofs. In towns, workshops hummed with apprentices, carding, spinning, weaving, their masters overseeing with practiced eyes. And in the distance, carts laden with bales of wool rolled slowly toward market, the future wealth of lords packed tightly beneath rough cloth coverings. Cloth, in the end, was not luxury but necessity. To have a tunic against cold, a cloak against rain, a blanket against frost, these were the basics of survival. Yet within necessity lay quiet pride, the even weave, the chosen dye, the strength of thread. Just as bread and ale sustained the body, so too did cloth sustain warmth and modest dignity. The medieval world might seem far away, but the sound of the loom, the touch of wool, the smell of dye were once as constant as heartbeat and breath. In that rhythm, life unfolded not quickly, not loudly, but steadily, softly. and with enduring patience. And so, in cottages and castles alike, the story of cloth and looms was woven into the very fabric of daily existence. Thread by thread, year after year, a quiet echo of human continuity. The medieval monastery was not only a place of prayer, but also a house of memory. Its stone walls rose with quiet gravity, enclosing cloisters, chapels, gardens, and dormitories. Yet, at its heart, lay the scriptorium, the workshop of words. Here, knowledge was not shouted in marketplaces or carried on battlefields. It was whispered into permanence by the careful strokes of quills across vellum. The monastery was a living library, and the scriptorium its beating heart. To step into a medieval scriptorium was to step into stillness. Narrow windows admitted muted shafts of light, softened by glass or horn, falling onto long wooden desks. Each desk bore a tilted surface upon which sheets of vellum were spread. The faint smell of parchment filled the air, mingling with candle wax, ink, and the earthy tang of rushes strewn upon the floor. The silence was deep but not empty. The scratching of quills, the turning of pages, and the occasional cough or murmur of Latin psalms gave the space a living rhythm. Monks sat in rows, hoods drawn forward, eyes bent to their tasks. Their fingers guided goosefeather quills, sharpened to fine points with small knives. Each dip into the inkpot was measured, deliberate, as though drawing not only letters but prayers. For indeed, to copy sacred texts was itself a devotion, each word of scripture transcribed as an offering. But the scriptoria did not contain only holy works. Alongside psalters and gospels lay works of philosophy, law, medicine, history, and even poetry. The monks were midwives of knowledge, ensuring that voices of antiquity and of their own day were carried forward. The process of creating a manuscript began long before ink touched vellum. First came the preparation of parchment itself. Calf's, sheepskin, or goatskin was stretched on frames, scraped with curved knives to thinness, washed, dried, and rubbed with pumice to smooth the surface. Each sheet bore subtle textures, the faint trace of veins, the ghost of hair follicles, of the living creature that had given its skin. These sheets, when bound, became vessels of memory, animal life transformed into human words. Ink was mixed in small pots, often from oak galls, steeped with iron salts, producing a deep black that flowed smoothly but aged into warm browns. Red ink, for initials and headings, came from cinnabar or vermilion, while rarer hues lapis lazuli for blue, saffron for yellow were treasures, sometimes as precious as gold leaf itself. The pigments were ground by hand, mixed with egg white, or gum arabic, stored in tiny shells or cups. A monk might spend as much time preparing his tools as actually writing. Once prepared, the work of transcription began. A text was read aloud by a lector, or passed from one manuscript to another, line by line. The scribe's task was not only to copy but to preserve, to prevent the erosion of memory by time's passing. Each letter was shaped with care, rounded, Carolingian, minuscule, precise, Gothic script, angular, and compressed. The page filled slowly, its neat lines testifying to patience. A slip of the quill, a blot of ink, was corrected with a knife, scraping away the error. The vellum smoothed and written again. Illuminators worked alongside scribes, adding beauty to words. Gold leaf was applied to initials, catching candlelight with brilliance. Margins bloomed with vines, animals, or saints, painted in miniature with astonishing delicacy. A page might take weeks to complete, its artistry turning text into vision. These illuminations were not decoration alone, they were meditations. In color, theology made visible. For the lords who supported monasteries, these scriptoria were instruments of both faith and power. A lord might endow a house with lands, cattle, or rents, ensuring that prayers were said for his soul and that his deeds were recorded. Charters, annals, genealogies, all passed through the quills of monastic scribes. To rule was to be remembered, and to be remembered required writing. Without scriptoria, much of medieval kingship and lordship would have vanished into silence. Yet the influence of these monastic workshops extended far beyond noble courts. They preserved the works of Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero, the medical treatises of Galen, the histories of Tacitus, the poetry of Virgil and Ovid. Through centuries of copying, the wisdom of Greece and Rome survived, carried across the dark centuries like flames sheltered from the wind. Without the quiet labor of monks, much of antiquity would have been lost. The Renaissance, centuries later, owed its rebirth of learning to these dimly lit halls. To imagine a scriptorium at work is to enter a world of profound concentration. Hours stretched long, punctuated only by the bells of the monastery matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, comp. At each toll, the monks set down quills, rose from benches, and processed into the chapel, chanting psalms. Then, returning, they bent again to their labor. The rhythm of day and night, prayer and work, was woven into each manuscript. A single book might take years to complete, each page a testament to devotion. The scriptorium was also a school. Novices learned not only to chant and pray, but to read, write, and illuminate. Senior monks guided their hands, corrected their letters, encouraged their patience. Through this apprenticeship, knowledge flowed from generation to generation, unbroken by time. Each novice, as he mastered his craft, became another link in the chain of preservation. There was discipline in this labor, but also serenity. To copy words was to let the mind dwell on them, slowly, deeply. Each phrase sank into memory, shaping thought. In this way, learning was not hurried but absorbed, like water seeping into earth. The silence of the scriptorium was a silence of attention, not emptiness. Within it, the human mind aligned with the steady rhythm of letters. Outside the walls, the world might swirl with wars, famine, or intrigue. Lords rose and fell, battles were won and lost, plagues swept through towns. Yet within the scriptorium, continuity endured. While swords clashed and fires burned, the quill moved steadily forward, line after line. This was the monastery's gift, a constancy untouched by noise, a thread of memory passing quietly through centuries. The beauty of a manuscript was not always visible to those who labored over it. Bound in leather, stored in chests, kept behind iron locks, the books were often seen only by a few. Yet their influence radiated far beyond the cloister. A copied gospel guided sermons, a legal code shaped judgments, a medical treatise informed healers. Knowledge, once transcribed, spread like ripples on water, unseen yet enduring. For the monks themselves, the act of writing was prayer. Each letter was an offering, each page a devotion. Mistakes were sins to be corrected, beauty was praise to be given. The patience required was itself a discipline of the soul. To spend a life copying texts was not drudgery but vocation, a way of sanctifying time. And so, in candlelight and silence, medieval scriptoria shaped the future. They carried faith, preserved wisdom, recorded history, and transmitted culture. Their rhythm was slow, their beauty quiet, their influence profound. To picture a monk bending over vellum, quill in hand, is to glimpse the hidden labor behind all later learning. Even now, when books are countless and words flash instantly across screens, the memory of scriptoria lingers. The steady scratch of quills, the glow of gold on parchment, the hush of cloistered halls, these remain emblems of patience, devotion, and care. They remind us that knowledge, once fragile, survived only because hands and hearts tended it with love. Thus, in the medieval world, the scriptorium was both workshop and sanctuary, both classroom and treasury. Within its walls, silence spoke, light glowed, and time itself seemed to move at the pace of ink across vellum. And from that slowness came continuity, the thread of thought unbroken across centuries. The medieval landscape was threaded with roads, sometimes paved with stone remnants of Rome, sometimes nothing more than earthen tracks pressed by centuries of hooves and footsteps. Along these roads moved not only lords with their retinues, or merchants with their carts, but also the quiet figures of pilgrims. Their journeys did not blaze with banners or clang with armor. Rather, they whispered with sandals on dust, with staff tapping softly against the earth, with murmured prayers carried on wind. The pilgrim's path was less a march than a rhythm, steady, patient, and deeply human. To watch pilgrims set forth was to witness a tapestry of humanity in motion. They came from villages and towns, from cottages and castles, driven by vows, by gratitude, by hope, or by penance. Some were peasants who saved coins over years to journey to a shrine. Others were nobles, wrapped in cloaks, yet walking with humility, seeking absolution for sins or blessings for heirs. Many traveled alone, yet more often they formed small groups, bound by companionship, for safety as well as solace. Together, they followed roads that curved through meadows alive with larks. over ridges where winds pressed cloaks close, and across rivers where bridges creaked or ferries swayed. Each road was marked not merely by its stones, but by the shrines that dotted its length. Wayside crosses, small chapels, or carved saints guided pilgrims as stars guided sailors. These shrines were places to rest, pray, or share bread. Villagers along the routes sometimes placed benches, offered water, or left lanterns lit for those arriving at dusk. The pilgrim was a guest everywhere, and the land itself seemed to prepare for his coming. Lords, too, recognized the sacred weight of such journeys. They granted charters for safe passage, maintained bridges, or protected certain stretches of road from bandits. To safeguard pilgrims was to safeguard not only souls, but reputations. For in the protection of the humble traveler lay the honor of the land. The pace of pilgrimage was deliberate, slow as the rhythm of breathing. Days began at dawn, with staff lifted and sandals tightened. The road stretched ahead, not as a challenge to be conquered, but as a companion to be embraced. Pilgrims paused to notice the silver glint of dew on grass, the call of a cuckoo, the scent of damp earth after rain. At midday, when the sun pressed down, they sought shade beneath oaks or willows, breaking bread, drinking water from leather flasks, and resting their feet. By evening, they reached hospices or monastic guest houses, where straw beds and simple meals awaited. These shelters, supported by lords or abbots, stood as beacons of hospitality, their doors open to the weary. In them, pilgrims found not only food, but stories shared by travelers from distant lands, each with reasons for walking. The diversity of pilgrims was striking. Beside a barefoot farmer trudging in woolen tunic might walk a knight, his sword left behind, his cloak plain. A mother carrying a child might step alongside an elderly man leaning heavily on his staff. Some walked in silence, eyes fixed inward on prayer. Others sang hymns, their voices rising in the open air, creating choruses that drifted across fields. Many carried token scallop shells for Compostela, palm branches for Jerusalem, badges of saints for Canterbury or Cologne. These tokens marked both identity and destination, signs of faith worn openly. Though pilgrims sought sacred places, the journey itself was sanctifying. Roads transformed them. Blisters and hunger taught humility. Shared bread taught fraternity. Long hours of walking taught patience. The landscape became scripture, the road itself a psalm. Hills were verses of effort, valleys lines of rest, rivers phrases of renewal. Even silence became a prayer, spoken not with lips but with steady steps. At times, danger intruded. Wolves haunted forests, bandits lurked near crossroads, sudden storms turned roads into rivers of mud. Yet these hardships bound pilgrims together. A stranger helped another across a swollen ford. A group formed a circle around a fire, keeping watch through night. Protection was found not only in lords' charters but in human kindness along the way. Villages and towns welcomed pilgrims with markets, inns, and fairs. A pilgrim arriving with tired eyes and dusted cloak brought not only need but blessing. Hosting a pilgrim was believed to earn merit, for in the guest one might unknowingly host Christ himself. Thus, cottages opened their doors, monasteries their cloisters, lords their barns. Hospitality turned the road into a chain of kindnesses, each link strengthening the next. At great shrines, the tomb of St. James at Compostela, the relics of Thomas Becket at Canterbury, the bones of saints in countless smaller chapels, pilgrims arrived in all. Their steps quickened as bells rang from towers, as the scent of incense drifted from open doors. Entering the sanctuary, they knelt, laid down tokens, whispered prayers, shed tears. For some, healing came embodied. For others, forgiveness eased their souls. For many, simply arriving was miracle enough. Proof that frailty could be borne, that miles could be conquered one gentle step at a time. Yet pilgrimage did not end at shrines. The return journey was also sacred. Pilgrims carried back relics, badges, or blessed tokens. But more than these, they carried stories. Villagers far from holy places heard of distant lands through their voices. Songs learned on the road were sung by hearths, prayers spoken in chapels. The pilgrim returned, transformed, his steps having traced not only roads but faith itself. Lords and peasants alike listened, sensing in these tales the breadth of a world knit together by roads, shrines, and hope. To imagine the gentle roads of pilgrimage is to imagine threads woven through the medieval world. They were not only physical paths but spiritual arteries, carrying devotion across landscapes. Each road bore countless footsteps, each step a word in a great unspoken prayer. And though centuries have passed, some of these roads remain. Modern travelers walk them still, their boots echoing the sandals of long ago, finding in the rhythm of steps a calm older than memory. In truth, pilgrimage mirrored life itself. To walk from village to shrine, from sunrise to sunset, was to enact the passage from birth to death, from this world to the next. Each bend in the road was a mystery, each rest a Sabbath, each arrival a foretaste of heaven. The pilgrim was not only a traveler but every human soul, moving gently across the earth, guided by hope, sustained by prayer, bound by the kindness of others. Thus, in the medieval world, pilgrims on gentle roads were more than wanderers. They were visible reminders that life was both rooted and moving, both local and universal. Their quiet steps echoed through fields and forests, through castles and cottages, through hearts and histories. They walked not to conquer but to connect, not to claim but to surrender, not to hurry but to trust. And in their walking they carried with them the resilience of humanity, the steady, humble, hopeful rhythm of feet on earth. Winter descended upon the medieval world, not suddenly but steadily, like a slow tightening of the earth's breath. Days shortened, shadows lengthened, and the air grew sharper with each passing dawn. Frost crept along hedgerows, painted pale, crystals across the rims of thatched roofs, and stiffened the ruts of well-trodden paths. The fields that once bustled with harvesters lay hushed and still, their furrows hidden beneath thin layers of snow. Trees stood bare, their skeletal limbs etched against a sky that turned grey too soon. In this quieting of the land, the rhythm of human life shifted inward, away from fields and open roads, toward the circles of firelight that flickered within cottages, manors, and castles. The hearth became the axis of existence. In peasant huts, where stone or clay chimneys barely carried away the smoke, fire was both blessing and burden. Sparks snapped and flared as logs caught, filling rooms with warmth but also with the acrid scent of wood smoke that lingered in hair and cloth. Families gathered tightly around the glow, for warmth was not evenly spread. The farther one sat from flame, the closer one came to cold. Yet the hearth was more than heat, it was a symbol of survival, a reminder that even when the world outside slept under snow, within the walls there was life, breath, and companionship. In these evenings, work shifted to the tasks that could be done indoors. Women spun wool by spindle or wheel, the steady hum mingling with the crackle of flame. Men mended tools, sharpening blades or repairing wooden handles, their hands skilled in patience rather than speed. Children sat near the warmth, sometimes drowsing against mother's skirts, sometimes playing with carved toys or learning to stitch. Old stories were told, tales of saints, of battles, of ancestors who had endured harsher winters still. Songs rose softly, accompanied perhaps by a simple flute or the rhythm of hands against wooden bowls. The long nights became canvases of memory, painted with words, music, and the glow of fire. For lords and their households, winter held both similarity and distinction. In the great halls of castles and manors, fires blazed in wide stone hearths, their light dancing across carved beams and tapestries. Retainers, servants, and kin gathered to share warmth, the crackling of logs blending with the murmur of voices and the clink of cups. Meals were hearty stews simmered in iron cauldrons, bread thick and dark, meats preserved by salt or smoke. The abundance of autumn harvests, stored in granaries and cellars, sustained noble and peasant alike. Yet here too, the hearth was not merely physical, it was a symbol of gathering, of household unity, of the Lord's role as center of order even during nature's slumber. Outside, silence reigned. Fields lay dormant, rivers slowed beneath thin crusts of ice, and animals huddled in barns or burrows. The world seemed hushed, as if holding breath until spring's return. Travelers were few. 4 roads turned treacherous with snow and ice. Markets diminished, fairs paused, and even church bells rang less frequently through frosted air. Life narrowed to the span of hearth and hall, to the warmth of company and the patience of waiting. Yet this narrowing carried its own richness. Winter evenings were times of reflection. Accounts were tallied, debts remembered, plans laid for spring sowing. Lords consulted stewards by firelight, reviewing the year's yields, considering next year's planting, arranging obligations of vassals. Peasants, too, planned mending clothes to last another season, preserving food carefully to stretch until the thaw. Each spark from the hearth seemed to illuminate not only present comfort, but future hope. The companionship of winter evenings cannot be overstated. In the intimacy of shared light, bonds deepened. Families, neighbors, and households relied on each other not for grandeur, but for presence. To sit near the hearth together was to reaffirm that survival was communal. Stories carried wisdom, laughter softened hardship, and even silence held companionship. Outside, wolves might prowl, winds might howl, but within, human warmth defied the cold. The hearth also held spiritual weight. Fires recalled ancient symbolism, the triumph of light over darkness, the promise of Christ's coming celebrated in Advent, the joy of Christmas feasts when halls filled with greenery and candles. In some villages, your logs were burned, their slow embers believed to protect households through the year. Priests preached of patience, of enduring winter as a season of trial but also of grace. Lords often sponsored feasts during these darkest months, sharing meat and ale with tenants as visible signs of their duty to protect and provide. Children cherished winter evenings for their wonder. Shadows on ceilings seemed to dance like spirits. Frost traced delicate patterns on windows as if drawn by unseen hands. The rare brightness of snow under moonlight turned fields into silver plains, inviting awe even from within doors. Laughter echoed as games were played indoors, as riddles were asked, as tales turned fanciful. These moments, simple yet profound, etched themselves into memory, the kind of memory that lingered long after the fires burned low. In monasteries, winter evenings were marked by similar rhythms, but different focus. Monks gathered in cloisters warmed by braziers, chanting prayers in steady cadence. Scriptoria continued their work by candlelight, though fingers numbed by cold often slowed progress. Silence filled the hours, broken only by the scratch of quills or the turning of vellum. Their hearths were spiritual as much as physical, sustaining not only bodies but souls in devotion. Lords who supported such houses knew that prayers rose unceasingly even in the stillness of winter nights. The architecture of hearths themselves told a story. In cottages, central pits evolved into chimneys that carried smoke upward, though often imperfectly. In castles, vast fireplaces were built into walls, with chimneys rising high above towers. In manors, hooded hearths directed smoke into flues, their hoods carved with symbols of family or faith. Around each hearth was gathered not only warmth, but identity, the physical core of home. As the season deepened, food stores dwindled, and meals grew simpler. Root vegetables, dried beans, salted meats, and stored grains became staples. Yet even these were prepared with care, for the act of cooking was itself an offering of warmth. The bubbling of pottage, the smell of bread, the steam rising from bowls all reassured that life endured. Ale brewed earlier in the year foamed in mugs, its comfort more psychological than potent. For lords, wines and spices added variety, but even their kitchens knew the rhythm of restraint in winter, and still, joy found its place. Feasts for Christmas and Epiphany brought light into darkness. Halls decorated with holly, ivy, and evergreen boughs reminded all that life persisted. Candles multiplied, music resounded, dancing echoed in rafters. For a time, winter's silence was broken by celebration, by communal affirmation that cold and dark could not extinguish spirit. Lords gave gifts, peasants exchanged tokens, children received small treats. Even amid scarcity, generosity bloomed, proving that hearths burned not only with wood but with human goodwill. When storms raged outside, when snow piled high against doors and winds rattled shutters, the hearth's role grew even clearer. Flames offered defiance. Within that circle of warmth, fear was kept at bay. Families huddled closer, stories grew longer, songs more insistent. The storm might roar, but it could not enter. Such nights etched into memory the contrast between chaos outside and order within, between nature's force and human resilience. Time itself altered in winter evenings. Without fields to labor, without long hours of daylight, people lived slower. The clock was the hearth. Logs added measured hours. Embers marked the passage of night. Sleep came earlier, dreams deeper, and mornings slower. This slowing was not seen as loss, but as rhythm. Just as fields rested beneath snow, so too did people rest within homes. Winter was not idleness, but preparation, a season of gathering strength for work to come. The symbolism of the hearth stretched further still. It stood for continuity. Fires were kept smoldering through nights, coals banked carefully so flame might spark anew with dawn. To let a fire die was more than inconvenience, it was a small defeat. Thus, each morning embers were stirred, logs placed, flame reborn. This daily renewal mirrored the hope that winter too would pass, that spring's warmth would return. In the hearts of lords and peasants alike, hearths carried dreams. Plans were whispered by firelight, marriages arranged, land discussed, journeys imagined. Children listened, learning not only stories but the cadence of community. Old men spoke of past winters survived, offering assurance that this one too would end. Women exchanged remedies, preserving health against coughs and fevers. Around flames, wisdom circulated as steadily as warmth. So winter evenings passed not quickly, but richly. Each spark against iron, each shadow on ceiling, each tale told, added to the quiet tapestry of life. Lords maintained their power through order and provision, peasants through endurance and unity, monks through prayer. Yet, in truth, all were bound by the same hearthlight, the same desire for warmth, the same trust in time's slow turning. To imagine medieval winter evenings is to imagine humanity at its most elemental, huddled against cold, yet unbroken, surrounded by darkness, yet illuminated by fire, pressed by scarcity, yet generous in companionship. The hearth was no mere tool but the heart of life, glowing against frost, whispering that even in deepest night, warmth endures. And so, winter itself, with all its length and stillness, became not an enemy but a teacher, reminding each generation that survival was not found in might or wealth alone, but in the gentle constancy of shared fire and shared time. Power in the medieval world was seldom as visible as banners on a battlefield or crowns upon a throne. The drama of kings and the clash of armies captured chronicles, but the lives of most people were shaped not by the spectacle of courts or wars, but by something quieter, steadier, and more enduring: the unseen presence of their lords. These figures, sometimes stern, sometimes generous, often distant, were less characters of legend than the architects of continuity. Their power was a hand that seldom raised its voice, yet always rested upon the shoulder of the land. The peasant who sowed barley in spring, the merchant who set up wares at the market, the shepherd who guided flocks over the hills, all of them moved within the order lords maintained: taxes and rents, tithes and tolls, permissions and protections. These were the threads that stitched daily existence into patterns of predictability. To live under a lord was not to feel the weight of tyranny each day, nor to see grandeur at every turn, but to inhabit a framework shaped by choices one seldom witnessed. Barns that filled with grain after harvest did not belong entirely to the hands that cut the stalks. A portion was set aside for the manor, another for the church. These measures were quiet, often unquestioned, yet they ensured that households of power remained strong. Roads were repaired or neglected at a lord's command, bridges built or left to crumble by his will. Markets thrived because charters allowed them, fairs continued because tolls sustained them, and justice was dispensed because authority lingered above. Lords did not appear in every cottage, but the shape of cottage life bore their mark. Their presence was most strongly felt in absence. A road untended, a barn unprotected, a dispute unresolved, all revealed how much depended upon their oversight. When lords failed, chaos crept quietly, like weeds through untended soil. Bandits grew bolder, neighbors quarreled unchecked, trade faltered, hunger spread. Power was therefore not only the ability to command, but the responsibility to prevent unraveling. In this sense, the silent hand of power was less about imposing than about preserving. The rhythms of feudal life reflected this. Each year brought its obligations, rents in coin or kind, labor days owed to the manor, harvest shares, and seasonal dues. These were rarely dramatic moments. Rather, they were recurring pulses of responsibility that bound tenant to lord. They did not fill songs or chronicles, but they filled ledgers, parchments, and memories. Like the tolling of bells, they reminded all of the order beyond themselves, a cadence that kept life steady through decades and generations. In villages, the manor house stood often as the visible reminder of this power. It might not be a castle of stone, but even a timbered hall upon a hill, with its storehouses and granaries, was enough to mark the locus of authority. From its doors came the reeve with instructions. From its tables came records of dues. From its storerooms came judgments of plenty or scarcity. The Lord might be absent, serving a king in war or journeying to court, but his authority lingered. Through stewards and bailiffs, even in absence, his hand remained. Power was also expressed through protection. Villages clustered near castles, not only for proximity to markets, but for safety beneath walls. The idea that one's grain and kin could take refuge in stone bastions during raids or wars brought reassurance. Lords, by maintaining these fortifications, projected a strength that was as much psychological as physical. Few villagers would ever sleep within the keep's chambers, yet the knowledge that such chambers existed offered comfort against uncertainty. Even justice delivered, not always with equity, but with consistency, was part of this silent power. Lords or their officers presided over disputes, recorded agreements, punished theft, resolved questions of land and marriage. The act was rarely grand. It often took place in a hall before assembled tenants, with words recorded by a scribe. Yet this routine of judgment kept peace from fragmenting. It told the people that grievances had recourse, that order had channels, that conflict did not need to fester into feud. Much of the power of lords was economic. Wool from sheep grazing upon their lands, grain from fields tilled under their oversight, tolls collected at bridges, markets, and mills. These revenues formed the bloodstream of medieval economies, yet for those who gave them, the experience was often mundane. A sack of oats, a coin of silver, a morning's labor in the domain field. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, but repeated endlessly, binding peasant survival to lordly prosperity. This continuity echoed the rhythms of nature. Just as the river flowed each season, just as the sun rose and set, so too did the obligations and protections of lordship continue. One might not notice the river each day, yet one depended upon it. One might not speak often of the sun, yet one lived by its light. So it was with the silent hand of power. It was rarely praised, often resented, sometimes ignored, but always. Their lords themselves were shaped by this role. To rule quietly required diligence more than drama. The wise lord measured harvests, consulted stewards, maintained walls, paid retainers, honored obligations to higher powers. His name might never resound in chronicles, yet his people prospered in steadiness. The negligent lord, by contrast, left his fields untended, his roads unsafe, his tenants embittered. His people remembered him not for greatness but for absence. Thus, power's silence was not emptiness but responsibility, a weight carried in decisions unseen. The church recognized this rhythm. Priests prayed for lords, not only for their salvation but for their governance. A good lord was praised as shepherd of his flock, guiding with firm yet quiet hand. A failing lord was admonished as one who neglected God's trust. Power, in this sense, was stewardship, to hold land and people in care, not merely in dominance. Such ideals were preached, even if reality often fell short, and they shaped expectations of what lords ought to be. For peasants, acknowledgement of lordship was woven into the smallest tasks. To grind grain at the mill was to pay a toll to the lord who maintained it. To gather wood in the forest was to respect the rights he reserved. To sell goods at the market was to contribute to his revenues. These acts were seldom resisted, for resistance was costly. Nor were they celebrated, for they were ordinary. They were simply the water in which daily life swam, unremarkable yet omnipresent. At times, however, the silence of power grew audible. A proclamation read in the village square, a levy called for war, a feast held at Christmas, all reminded tenants that their lord's hand was not only silent but commanding. Yet even these moments faded quickly back into the ordinary rhythm of dues and duties. The contrast only emphasized how much of lordship was steady, not spectacular. In this sense, medieval power resembled the seasons. Spring might bring sowing, summer labor, autumn harvest, winter rest. But beneath each visible change lay the same earth, the same cycles, the same continuity. Lords were the soil in which society rooted. Kings might change, wars might come and go, but the manor, the obligations, the rents, and the protections endured. The silence of this power was its strength. It did not rely on noise to be real. Even in memory, this silence persisted. Chronicles celebrated kings and knights, but villagers remembered the lord who kept peace, who ensured grain in famine, who protected them in danger. His name might not echo across realms, but it lingered in local tales, in the steady walls of a manor still standing, in the customs repeated long after his death. Silent power left traces not in glory but in habit, in the deep grooves of life passed from generation to generation. Thus, the medieval world was built not only upon swords and banners but upon quiet continuities. Lords, in their daily and unseen governance, were less the thunderclaps of history than the steady rainfall. They did not dazzle, but they endured. Their power was not always just, nor always kind, but it was consistent, binding together lives that might otherwise have scattered into chaos. To understand medieval life, one must not look only to battlefields and coronations, but to hearths and barns, to markets and mills, to the silent hand of power that shaped them all. It was a hand that seldom appeared in story, yet without it, the stories could not exist. Like the steady flow of rivers, like the cycle of seasons, like the passage of stars overhead, it was quiet, enduring, and inescapable. As we come to the end of our slow journey through the medieval world, it is worth pausing to notice the steady threads that have bound our path together. We began with the glow of lanterns in a great hall, their light spilling across stone walls and wooden beams. We traveled outward into fields, villages, gardens, markets, and monasteries. We walked along the quiet roads of pilgrims and stood beside hearths on long winter nights. Each step has shown us that power in the medieval world was not always loud or sudden, but soft, steady, and enduring. It was not only the clang of armor or the shouts of a battlefield. More often, it was the rhythm of ordinary lives, shaped gently but persistently by the unseen hand of lords who seldom needed to raise their voices. Power in this age was expressed through continuity. A steward's ledger, filled with rows of numbers and simple notes about rents and dues, carried more weight than a sword thrust in anger. A bell tolling across a misty valley could organize the time of hundreds more effectively than any shouted command. The castle's silent walls, weathering years of rain and sun, reminded villagers of stability more than they did of war. When we listen closely to history, we find that order was maintained not by spectacle, but by small repetitions, harvests gathered, bread baked, cloth woven, prayers whispered, roads traveled, fires tended. This quietness is what makes the medieval world feel almost like a long dream. It unfolded at the pace of seasons, not hours. The rise of the sun and the turning of the year meant more than the decrees of faraway kings. A family might never see their lord directly, yet his presence was always there in the granary that held their stored grain, in the marketplace where their goods could be traded, in the chapel bell that marked the hours of work and rest. Lords did not need to shout, because their power was woven into the very fabric of life. And so, when we look at the medieval centuries, we should not imagine only banners flying in battle or grand coronations in cathedrals. Instead, we should imagine the small, steady labors that made those moments possible. A feast in a lord's hall was only possible because peasants bent over their fields in spring and autumn. A fine cloak worn at court was the result of countless spinners, dyers, and weavers working in cottages where looms creaked day after day. A journey to a distant shrine could only happen because lords maintained roads and offered protection to travelers. Even books copied in monasteries, those slow works of quill and ink, carried forward not just prayers but the memory of entire kingdoms. The influence of medieval lords was rarely sudden. It was gradual, like water wearing a stone, or like the steady growth of crops in a field. They did not need to appear daily in the lives of their people. Instead, they set the conditions in which life could unfold. Their control was measured in barns filled, tolls collected, and markets allowed to flourish. Their presence was felt in the slow assurance that there was order, that survival was possible, and that generations could continue. And yet, for all the importance of lords and their quiet guidance, the deeper rhythm of medieval life lay in the ordinary people themselves. Families tending gardens of leeks and cabbages, women brewing ale or spinning wool, children chasing each other through stubbled fields after harvest. All of these lives gave shape to history every bit as much as castles and halls did. The quiet pulse of society came from kitchens, hearths, cottages, and workshops. Lords may have directed the flow, but the river of life ran with the countless efforts of common hands. When we think of the medieval past, it is tempting to imagine it as harsh or dark. Yet, What we find in these gentle glimpses is a life filled with patience and steady joys. Markets offered moments of color and exchange. Harvests brought laughter and songs. Even winter nights, though cold, offered warmth in stories told by firelight. To live then was to live in a world where time stretched slowly, where life was measured not in hours of urgency, but in cycles of nature and habit. And within those cycles, the presence of lords offered a structure, like the frame of a loom upon which the fabric of society was woven. The power of lords was real, but it was quiet. It was the silent hand that ensured barns were built, that tolls were collected, that roads were safe, that markets were orderly, that bells could be rung, and that monasteries could copy their books without fear of interruption. Their influence was steady, often unseen, and lasting. In this way, lords shaped kingdoms, not by bursts of command, but by continuous oversight. As the medieval world passed through centuries, so too did these rhythms endure. Lanterns were lit in great halls each evening. Fields ripened and were harvested each year. Stewards balanced their ledgers with ink and patience. Pilgrims continued their long, slow steps on roads lined with hedges and streams. Monks bent over parchment, shaping letters as carefully as prayers. Villagers listened to their bells. Markets filled with voices and scents, and families gathered around winter hearths. Through all of this, the presence of lords was constant, but gentle, guiding without noise, ruling without spectacle. And so, as we let this journey close, it feels almost as though we are stepping back out of a dream. We have wandered through candlelit halls, along misty fields, into gardens heavy with herbs, and through markets alive with quiet voices. We have watched castles stand against the wind, and we have felt the hush of winter evenings. Everywhere, the pattern has been the same. Life moved slowly, and power was steady, quiet, and enduring. Perhaps this is the final lesson the medieval world can offer us, that history is not only made of noise and battles, but also of silence and routine. It is in the repetition of meals, the weaving of cloth, the tolling of bells, and the keeping of ledgers that true continuity is found. Lords knew this, and it was why their influence endured across generations. They held power not through constant display, but through the quiet assurance that order would continue. In the end, medieval life was not a story of constant struggle, nor was it one of endless grandeur. It was a balance between the two, carried forward by the rhythm of ordinary days and the silent presence of those who guided them. Just as rivers carved valleys slowly, and just as seasons turn year after year, so too did lords shape their kingdoms, not with sudden bursts of command, but with the enduring patience of continuity. The glow of lanterns, the toll of bells, the turning of wheels at the loom, the scratching of quills, the creak of carts on roads, the laughter of children at harvest, the warmth of hearths in winter, all of these sounds and sights belong to the same story, a story of quiet lives lived under the gentle but persistent influence of unseen hands. It is a reminder that power can be soft, that history can be calm, and that the past, though distant, still whispers with the echoes of ordinary days. And so we leave this world, as the villagers once did, with the sound of bells drifting across fields, with smoke curling gently from chimneys, with lanterns glowing in stone halls, and with the steady rhythm of life moving forward, quietly, endlessly, and enduringly.